Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Okay, so I've never really shared this with anyone outside of a few close friends. And even then, I don't think they fully understood how messed up it was. But I've been carrying this around for decades now, and I guess typing it out might help. Or maybe it'll just bring it all back. Either way, here goes. This happened back in the late 70s. I think it was 1978 or 79. I can't remember exactly which. But it was opening day of deer season in Georgia, out near Clarks Hill Lake. I'd been hunting since I was a kid, so I was used to the early mornings, the cold, the quiet. But this year, something was different right from the start. I remember driving out there with my buddy. He's passed now, which makes this even harder to talk about, and we were both pumped. Opening day is always a big deal, you know? Everyone's hoping to bag a nice buck, the air's crisp, and there's this feeling like anything could happen, but not like what did. We got to our usual spot, set up camp the night before. It was just a simple setup. Tents, a fire pit, coolers full of beer and food. Nothing fancy. I remember the sky was clear, stars everywhere, and it was cold enough that you could see your breath. We stayed up late talking trash, planning where we'd go in the morning. I decided I wanted to try a tree stand. I'd scouted a few weeks earlier, one that was real close to the water. It was about 25 feet up in an old oak, overlooking a clearing near the lake. I liked it because deer would often come down to drink, and the view was good. Little did I know. I woke up way before daylight, maybe around 4 in the morning. It was pitch black, and I could hear the others still snoring in their tents. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I slipped out quiet, grabbed my gear, my rifle, a thermos of coffee, and my flashlight. The air was thick with fog. I mean really dense, like you could barely see 10 feet in front of you. It had rolled in overnight, and it made everything feel eerie. The woods were dead silent, no birds, no wind, just this heavy quiet that made my skin crawl. But I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the fog playing tricks on me. I made my way to the tree stand, using my flashlight to see, but the beam just bounced off the fog, making it worse. It was like walking through soup. I climbed up into the stand, settled in, and started waiting. That's the thing about hunting. It's mostly waiting, just sitting there, listening, watching. I remember sipping my coffee, trying to stay warm and just soaking in the stillness. But then, after maybe an hour, I started hearing something. At first, it was faint, like a distant cry. I thought it might be an owl or something, but it didn't sound right. Owls hoot. This was different. It was a screaming sound, high-pitched and raw, almost like a woman screaming, but not quite. It sent a chill right through me. I've heard coyotes before, and bobcats, they can make some awful noises, but this was nothing like that. It was deeper, more guttural, and it was getting closer. I remember my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped my rifle tighter, but my hands were shaking. I was 25 feet up, supposed to be safe, but suddenly I felt exposed, like I was a target. The screams kept coming, each one louder than the last, and they were moving fast. I could hear branches snapping, brush being disturbed, like something big was crashing through the woods. It was headed straight for me. I fumbled for my flashlight, pointing it down, but the fog was so thick that the light just dissolved into this gray haze. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. The sounds were right below me now, and I froze. I mean, literally froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body went rigid with fear, and I just sat there listening to this thing pass directly under my tree. I could hear it brushing against the lower branches, rustling the leaves, and there was this smell, like wet dog and something else, something rotten. It was overwhelming. The screams were so loud at that point, they felt like they were vibrating through the tree. I thought for sure it knew I was there, that it was coming for me. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds faded, moving away into the distance. The woods went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, heavy and ominous. I stayed in that tree stand for what felt like hours, too scared to move. The sun started to come up, but the fog didn't lift. It just turned from black to grey, making everything feel even more surreal. I kept expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Eventually, I climbed down, my legs wobbly, and I remember my hands were still trembling so bad I could barely pack up my gear. I hurried back to camp, half running, half walking, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got back, the others were up, starting breakfast over the fire. I must have looked like hell because my buddy asked if I was okay. I tried to play it cool, but I couldn't. I told him what I heard, and his face went pale. He said around 10:30 that morning he'd been out near his stand and heard something similar. Screams that didn't sound right, moving fast through the woods. We compared notes, and it was the same thing. But the weird part was, no one else in camp had heard anything. They just laughed it off, said we were imagining things or it was a bear or something. But bears don't scream like that. Nothing I've ever heard does. We spent the rest of the day talking about it, trying to make sense of it, but we couldn't. The fear stayed with me, like a cold weight in my chest. Even after we packed up and left, I couldn't shake it. And then, the next weekend, when I went back and shot a deer, my friend found that matted hair near his stand, strands nearly 20 inches long, thick and coarse. He took it to the University of Georgia to get it analyzed, and they said it wasn't from a horse or a pig or anything they could identify. But that's another story, and he's gone now. So I'm left with this memory, this terror from that morning in the fog. I've never gone back to that tree stand, and I still don't know what it was that passed under me, screaming like it was from another world. Story 2. So, I was out on this river in Alabama, just canoeing like I do sometimes to unwind after a long week. It was one of those late afternoons where the sun starts dipping low and everything gets that golden glow, but you know it's not going to last long. Dusk was creeping in, and I knew I had to get my gear out and packed up before it got fully dark. I'm not superstitious or anything, but being alone in the woods after sunset always gives me the heebie-jeebies, even on a good day. This particular spot was pretty remote, a bend in the river where the trees crowd in close and the water moves slow and quiet. I'd been coming here for years, ever since I moved to the area, and it usually felt peaceful, like my own little escape. That day, I'd been on the water for a couple of hours, just paddling lazy loops, watching the birds skim the surface and listening to the cicadas buzzing in the trees. The air was thick and humid, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back even when you're not moving much. I remember thinking how nice it was to be away from all the noise of town, just me and the river. I'd brought my usual gear, a small cooler with some drinks and snacks, my fishing rod, though I hadn't caught anything, and my trusty old canoe. That canoe's a beast. It weighs about 75 pounds, and hauling it in and out of the water is always a workout, but it's worth it for the solitude. As dusk started to settle in, I decided it was time to call it a day. I pulled up to the bank where I'd launched from earlier, a muddy slope that leads up to a steep hill. Beyond that hill is a highway, but from down by the river, you'd never know it was there. It feels like you're miles from anywhere. I started unloading my stuff, tossing the cooler and rod into the back of my truck, which was parked up near the road. My mind was wandering, thinking about what I'd make for dinner later, maybe just order a pizza and crash on the couch. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, just as I was about to grab the canoe and start dragging it up the hill, I heard it. It came from maybe a quarter-mile away, maybe a half-mile. Hard to tell with the way sound carries over water. A loud series of whoops, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an owl. I know owl calls, and this was way too powerful, too raw. It sounded almost human, but not quite. More like if a person tried to imitate a gorilla or something, but with this eerie, echoing quality that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I froze right where I was, one hand on the canoe, and just listened. My heart started hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was a pause, maybe 5 or 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. The woods had gone dead quiet, like everything else had stopped to listen too. No birds, no insects, nothing. Then it came again. 3 more whoops, each one a bit shorter than the last, but just as loud and unsettling. They seemed to come from the same direction, deep in the trees across the river. I've spent enough time outdoors to know most animal sounds, coyotes, foxes, even bobcats, but this was different. It had an intelligence behind it, like it was communicating something, but I had no idea what. Fear hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just nervousness, it was this primal, gut-level terror that made my legs feel weak. I've been scared before, like that time I almost stepped on a snake, but this was worse. This felt like something was out there, something big and aware of me. My mind flashed back to a month earlier, when I'd been watching some TV show about cryptids, Bigfoot in particular. I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking it was all nonsense. But sitting there by the river, with that sound ringing in my ears, it didn't seem so funny anymore. I didn't stop to think. I just knew I had to get out of there fast. I grabbed the canoe, all 75 pounds of it, and started hauling it up the hill. Normally I'd take my time, maybe rest halfway, but not this time. I was practically running, my boots slipping on the wet leaves and mud. The hill is steep, maybe a 45-degree angle, and it's covered in roots and rocks that trip you up if you're not careful. But I didn't care. I just powered through, my arms burning from the weight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every few steps, I'd glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the trees, but there was nothing, just the deepening shadows and the quiet river behind me. That made it worse in a way, not knowing what was there. The whoops had stopped, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. I could smell the damp earth and my own sweat, and my heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I remember thinking, this is insane. I'm freaking out over nothing. But my body wasn't listening. Adrenaline was pumping through me, making my hands shake. The canoe kept banging against my legs, and I almost dropped it a couple of times, but I held on tight. I didn't even bother to secure it properly. I just wanted to get to the highway, to my truck, to something familiar and safe. The thought of being stuck down there in the dark with whatever made that sound was unbearable. When I finally reached the top of the hill, I collapsed against my truck, panting and trembling. The highway was quiet, just an occasional car whizzing by in the distance, but it felt like a different world. I fumbled with the keys, my hands so shaky I could barely get the door open. I threw the canoe into the bed of the truck, not even strapping it down, just letting it lie there, and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately, like that would make a difference, and just sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I looked back toward the river, but it was all shadows now, the last bits of light fading from the sky. Nothing moved, no more sounds, but the memory of those whoops was stuck in my head, playing over and over. I kept asking myself what it could have been. A prank, maybe someone messing around. But out here, this area isn't exactly populated. It's mostly state land, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. Or an animal, but nothing I knew of made a sound like that. As I drove away, my hands were still gripping the steering wheel too tight, and I had to force myself to relax. The whole way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard something I wasn't supposed to. It wasn't just scary, it was deeply unsettling, like I'd brushed up against something ancient and wild that didn't belong in my ordinary life. Later, when I got home, I did what anyone would do. I went online and started searching. I found recordings of Sasquatch calls, and my blood ran cold. They matched what I'd heard almost exactly, those same deep whooping sounds that don't fit any known animal. I even reached out to some local researchers later on, and they confirmed that no one had been out there that day, no groups or hoaxes reported. Over the next few months, I heard stories from other people in the area about strange experiences, footprints, odd noises, things moving in the woods. But nothing ever came close to that moment for me, but all that came later. That day, sitting in my truck, driving away from the river, all I could think about was how close I'd felt to something I couldn't explain. The terror was so raw, so immediate, that it stuck with me ever since. Even now, years later, if I'm out in the woods and I hear an unusual sound, my heart jumps, and I remember those whoops echoing across the water. I never went back to that spot alone, and I doubt I ever will. Some things you just can't unhear, and that sound, whatever it was, is one of them. I still don't know what it was, and maybe I never will, but that day changed how I see the outdoors forever. It's not just peace and quiet anymore. There's an edge to it now, a reminder that we don't know everything about the world, and maybe that's for the best. Story 3. I've always been the kind of person who gets obsessed with old books, not the fancy leather-bound kind you see in movies, but the real, dusty, falling apart ones that smell like time and forgotten places. It's a quiet hobby. Most of the time, it's just me, a reading lamp, and a sense of peace. But that all changed about 3 months ago. I haven't been the same since. I can't sleep right. I startle at noises outside my apartment, and I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. It all comes back to one book, one single, terrifying book. It was a Tuesday, I remember that much, a completely normal, overcast Tuesday. I'd gotten a package in the mail from a small specialty bookseller I sometimes use. I'd ordered a reprint of an old Tibetan medical text, something called the Anatomical Dictionary for Recognizing Various Diseases. The listing said it was a modern reprint of an original from the 1700s, sourced from some monastery in Mongolia. I was excited. This was exactly my kind of thing, a glimpse into how people centuries ago understood the world, their bodies, the animals around them. I opened the package on my kitchen table. The book was heavier than I expected, bound in a simple dark green cover with no title. It felt serious. The paper was thick, a rough, pulpy texture that felt real under my fingertips, not like the glossy pages of modern books. The printing was a bit faded in places, like the scan hadn't been perfect, which just added to its charm. I made a cup of tea, sat down at the table, and started to slowly flip through it. The first sections were what you'd expect, detailed, if slightly inaccurate, drawings of human anatomy, charts of herbs, descriptions of symptoms for various fevers and ailments. It was fascinating. I could almost see some ancient healer, hunched over a candle, carefully inking these pages, trying to make sense of the pain and sickness they saw every day. I spent a good hour just poring over these sections, admiring the artistry, feeling that connection to the past. Then I turned a page, and my heart just stopped for a second. It was a drawing of a creature. It was titled, in clear, printed letters, Elmas. My first thought was that it was some kind of mythological entry, like a griffin or a dragon, something symbolic. But the book didn't have any other mythological creatures. It had yaks and snow leopards and bears and all sorts of real, recognizable animals, all drawn with the same clinical, observational style. And this thing, it was drawn with that same stark, factual detail. It was huge. The drawing showed it standing next to a pine tree for scale, and it was easily half again as tall as the tree. Its body was shaped like a man's. Broad shoulders, a powerful torso, long muscular arms that hung past its knees, but it was covered in this coarse, dark hair, shaggy and thick. Its face was the worst part. It wasn't a bear's face. It was flatter, with a heavy brow ridge, but you could see the shape of a human skull underneath all that hair. The eyes were small and dark, just two black dots on the page, but they felt intelligent. Not human, but not animal either. Something else. Something that was looking right out of the paper at me. My hands got cold. I remember setting my tea-sip down because I was afraid I'd drop it. I leaned in closer, my heart hammering against my ribs now. I had to read the description. The text was in Tibetan with a small printed translation in Chinese at the bottom. My Tibetan is basically non-existent, but I could follow the Chinese. It described the Elmas as a man animal, living in the highest, most remote mountains. It said its origins were close to that of a bear. It talked about its enormous, almost unbelievable strength. And then it got to the part that made my skin crawl. It said the meat of the Elmas could be used to treat mental diseases, hysteria, madness, melancholy, and its gallbladder, was a cure for jaundice. I sat back in my chair, and a full-body shudder went through me. This wasn't written like a fairy tale. It was written like a pharmacopoeia. It was a recipe. This book, this dry medical text, was calmly stating that you could hunt this thing, this man-shaped monster, and use its body parts as medicine. It was listed right alongside uses for bear bile and powdered rhino horn. It was presented as fact. That's when the real terror started to sink in. It wasn't the drawing itself, it was the context, the absolute matter-of-fact credibility of it all. The author of this book wasn't some superstitious peasant. This was a scholar, a doctor. He believed this creature was real. He believed it lived in the mountains, and he believed in its medicinal properties. To him, the Elmas was just another resource, like a specific kind of root or a mineral. A dangerous, terrifying resource, but a real one. My mind was racing. I had to know more. I abandoned my tea and went to my laptop, my fingers fumbling over the keys. I looked up the book's provenance again. The original was supposed to be housed in a place called the Gand Lemissary at Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I couldn't find much about that, just a few vague references in academic databases. But then I found a reference to an anthropologist who had studied a copy of this same text, a copy that had made its way to Peking, that's the old name for Beijing, sometime in the 18th century, and in that copy the name had changed. It wasn't called Elmas anymore, it was called Yerin, the wild man. Seeing that term, wild man, in a modern academic context hit me even harder. It wasn't just one isolated, crazy book. The legend, or the knowledge, or whatever it was, had traveled. It had evolved, but the core of it remained the same. A large, hairy, man-like creature in the mountains. I spent the next few hours falling down a rabbit hole. I read accounts, old and new, from the Himalayan foothills, from the remote forests of China. Stories from hunters who claimed to have seen huge bipedal shapes moving through the trees. Folklore from villages about the mountain men you should never approach. It was all there, this consistent, whispering thread of something that didn't fit, something that was supposed to be a myth but refused to completely die. And the medical angle, the idea of its body as a cure, that haunted me the most. It added a layer of horrible practicality to the myth. It gave people a reason to seek it out, not just to fear it, but to hunt it, to carve it up. The book wasn't just describing a monster, it was creating a price on its head. The light in my apartment started to fade. I hadn't noticed the time passing. The grey Tuesday sky had turned to a deep twilight blue. I was sitting in the near dark, the glow from my laptop screen the only light in the room. I felt drained, but also wired, like I'd had too much coffee. My shoulders were tight knots. I could feel a headache starting behind my eyes. I got up to turn on a lamp, and that's when I heard it, a thump from outside. I live on the ground floor of an apartment building. My window looks out onto a small wooded area that separates our complex from the main road. It's not a huge forest, just a thick patch of trees, maybe 100 yards deep. I hear animals out there all the time, raccoons, possums, sometimes deer. This was not a raccoon sound. It was too heavy, too solid. It was the sound of something big stepping on a dry branch and snapping it clean in two. I froze, my hand still outstretched towards the lamp switch. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, completely still, listening so hard my ears started to ring with the silence. Nothing. Maybe it was a deer, a big buck. They can sound surprisingly heavy when they move through the undergrowth. Then I heard it again. Crunch. This one was closer, much closer, right at the edge of the tree line just beyond my window. My heart was a frantic drumbeat in my chest. I could feel the pulse in my neck, in my temples. This was stupid. This was paranoia. I'd just spent the whole day reading about a monster and now my brain was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to take a step towards the window. The blinds were mostly closed, but there were gaps between the slats. I didn't want to look. I really didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to prove to myself that it was nothing. I leaned forward slowly, my knees feeling weak. I pressed my face to the cool glass, peering through one of the narrow gaps in the blinds. The woods were dark, the last of the twilight was gone, and the moon was hidden behind clouds. It was just a wall of blackness. I couldn't see anything. I stood there, my forehead against the window, straining my eyes, trying to make out shapes in the gloom. For a long moment there was nothing, just the faint sigh of the wind in the pine needles. I started to feel like an idiot. Of course it was nothing. My imagination, fueled by that damned book, had gotten the better of me. I was about to pull away, to laugh at myself and finally turn on the damn light, when I saw it. Movement. A patch of darkness that was deeper than the rest shifted. It was tall, impossibly tall. It didn't move like a person, not exactly. It was more of a slow, deliberate sway, a massive shape resolving itself from the shadows. I couldn't see any details, just a towering silhouette that blotted out the few distant lights I could usually see from the road. It was just there. A solid mass of darkness, standing at the very edge of the trees, looking towards my window. A cold, sharp fear, colder than any I have ever felt, shot through me. It was a physical sensation, like being doused in ice water. My stomach clenched, my breath fogged the glass in front of me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I was pinned there, a terrified statue locked in a stare, with something I couldn't even properly see. The smell hit me next. It came through the tiny cracks around the window frame. It was a smell I'd never encountered before, and I hope I never do again. It was a mix of things. Damp earth, like a deep cave, and something musky, like a wet dog. But underneath it all was this foul, pungent, rotten sweetness. It was the smell of something old, something wild, something that didn't belong here, outside my window, in my normal, boring world. The silhouette didn't move again. It just stood there. I could feel it looking at me. I knew with a certainty that felt like a stone in my gut, that it knew I was in here. It knew I was looking back. Then a low sound rumbled through the glass. It wasn't a growl, not like a bear or a dog. It was deeper, more guttural, a vibration I felt in my bones, more than I heard with my ears. It was a sound of pure, simple presence, a notification of its existence. That sound broke the spell. I stumbled back from the window, my legs finally giving way. I fell onto the floor, scrambling backwards on my hands and knees until my back hit the opposite wall. I curled into a ball there in the dark, my arms wrapped around my head, trying to make myself small. I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I was crying hot, silent tears of sheer, unadulterated terror. I don't know how long I stayed like that. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been an hour. Time lost all meaning. I just listened, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the sound of the window shattering, for the door to be ripped from its hinges. But nothing happened. The smell faded. The heavy silence outside returned. The normal night sounds, the crickets, the distant hum of a car slowly started up again, as if they'd been holding their breath too. I stayed on the floor for a long time. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the window, waiting for the sun to come up. When the first grey light of dawn finally filtered through the blinds, I forced myself to get up. My body ached from tension. I walked to the window, my heart still pounding, and I looked out. There was nothing there, just the normal tree line, the morning dew on the grass. But down there, in the soft, wet earth right below my window, were footprints. They were huge, long, broad and deep. They weren't bear tracks. I looked that up later. Bears have a distinct paw shape with claws. These were different. They looked almost human, but no human has a foot that big. And in the center of the largest print, pressed deep into the mud, was a single, long, coarse, dark brown hair. I never called the police. What would I say? I saw a shadow. I smelled something bad. I have a weird footprint and a piece of hair. They'd think I was crazy. I threw the anatomical dictionary in the dumpster behind my building that morning. I couldn't bear to have it in my home, but it was too late. The damage was done. I saw the drawing. I read the description, and then, I think, it saw me back. I can't prove it. I have no evidence anyone would believe, but I know what I felt. I know what I smelled. I know what was standing out there in the dark. The book said its meat could cure madness. But all it left me with was a fear I can't shake, and the chilling, unshakable knowledge that the things in the old books, sometimes they're still out there, and sometimes they know we're reading about them. Story 4. Okay, so this is something that happened to me and my college roommates back in October of 1998. We were all in our early 20s, just a bunch of guys looking to get away from campus for a weekend, and we decided to go trout fishing on the Thompson River in Okin County, South Carolina. I'd been there a couple times before with my dad when I was a kid, so I knew the area a little, but this was the first time I was going with just friends. There were 3 of us, me and 2 other guys from the dorm. We packed up my old pickup truck with fishing gear, a cooler full of beer and sandwiches and our camping stuff, and we headed out early on a Saturday morning. The drive was pretty uneventful, just a lot of joking around and listening to CDs. We got to the river around noon, and the weather was perfect for October. Cool, but not cold, with the leaves starting to turn colors. The Thompson River isn't some huge waterway. It's more like a wide creek, with rocky banks and dense woods on either side. We found a spot that looked good for camping, not too far from the water, but tucked back in a little clearing surrounded by pine trees. It felt secluded, which was what we wanted, but not so far out that we couldn't hear the occasional car on the distant road. We spent the first couple of hours setting up camp. We had a cheap tent that took forever to put together because one of the poles was bent, and we ended up laughing about it instead of getting frustrated. After that, we got our fishing rods out and waded into the river. The water was cold, really cold, and it sent a shock through my waders every time I took a step. We caught a few trout, nothing huge, but enough for dinner later. The sun was starting to go down, casting long shadows through the trees, and we decided to head back to camp to start a fire and cook the fish. That's when things started to get weird. We were just finishing up with the fire, getting the flames going good, when we heard this sound from the ridge above us. It was like a child crying, but not quite. It was higher pitched and sort of broken, like sobs mixed with whimpers. At first, I thought it was a bobcat. I'd heard them before when I was hunting with my uncle, and they can sound eerily human sometimes. One of my roommates, the more nervous one, said, "What the hell is that?" But I shrugged it off. "Probably just a bobcat," I told him. "They're around here." He didn't look convinced, but we went back to what we were doing. We cooked the trout over the fire, and it tasted amazing, fresh and smoky. We were sitting around, eating and drinking beer, joking about classes and girls, when we heard the crying again. This time it was closer, and it didn't stop after a few seconds like before. It went on for a minute or so, just this steady, sad sound coming from the woods. The sun had fully set by then, and it was getting dark fast. The fire was our only light, and it made the trees around us look like they were moving. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, but I still tried to play it cool. "It's just an animal," I said, but my voice sounded tighter than I meant it to. Then the stones started. At first, it was just one. A small river stone about the size of my fist landed in the middle of our camp with a soft thud. We all jumped. "What was that?" someone said. We looked around, but we couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. The woods were pitch black now, and the crying had stopped. We figured maybe it was a raccoon or something messing with us, but then another stone came flying in, this one hitting the side of the tent with a louder smack. That's when I started to get really uneasy. Stones don't just fly out of nowhere. I remember my heart starting to pound, and I could feel this cold sweat on my back, despite the cool air. I told the guys to stay close to the fire, and I went to my truck to get my 9mm pistol. I always kept it locked in the glove compartment when we went camping, just in case of snakes or whatever, but I never thought I'd actually need it. As I walked to the truck, which was parked about 20 feet away, I could feel eyes on me. It was this intense, prickling sensation. Like someone was watching from the trees. I grabbed the gun and made sure it was loaded, my hands shaking a little. When I got back to the fire, my roommates were staring into the darkness, their faces pale in the firelight. We decided to build the fire bigger, hoping it would scare whatever it was away. We gathered more wood, dead branches and logs from around the camp, and piled them on until the flames were leaping up, casting flickering shadows that danced all over the place. The heat was intense, and it made the air around us feel thick and smoky. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. No crying, no stones. We started to relax a bit, thinking maybe it was over. But then the knocking started. It was this deep, rhythmic sound, like someone hitting a tree with a big stick. Thump, thump, thump. It came from the ridge where we'd heard the crying earlier. The sound was heavy and deliberate, not random. It would go on for about 10 seconds, stop, and then start again after exactly 10 minutes. I counted the intervals because it was so regular, it was creepy. Between the knocks, we'd hear the crying again. But now it sounded different, more frantic, almost angry. It wasn't like a bobcat anymore. It was something else, something I'd never heard before. My roommates were freaking out. One of them kept saying, "We should leave, man. Let's just pack up and go." But it was pitch black out, and the road was a good half-mile hike through rough terrain. I didn't want to risk walking in the dark with whatever was out there. Plus, the truck was right there, but we'd have to drive slowly on the dirt track, and I was afraid something might follow us. So we stayed put, huddled around the fire, with me holding the 9mm tight in my hand. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. The fire was bright, but it only lit up a small circle, and beyond that, the darkness felt alive. Then the stones started again, but this time it was worse. They weren't just landing in the camp. They were thudding all around us, hitting the ground with so much force that dirt and pebbles flew up. Some of them were big too, the size of baseballs. They'd come from different directions, like whatever was throwing them was moving around us. We couldn't see anything, just hear the whistling sound as they flew through the air, and then the loud thud when they hit. One stone landed so close to my foot that I felt the vibration through the ground. I yelled into the darkness, "Hey, stop it!" But nothing happened except another stone whizzing past my head. I didn't even hear it coming until it was too late. I just felt the air move. The fear was overwhelming at that point. My chest was tight, and I was breathing fast, like I'd been running. My hands were clammy, and I had to keep wiping them on my jeans to get a better grip on the gun. My roommates were pressed up against me, and I could feel them shaking. We were all sweating, even though the night air was cool. The fire was roaring, but it didn't seem to help anymore. The knocking and crying kept going, every 10 minutes like clockwork, and the stones kept coming in bursts. It felt like we were under siege, but by something we couldn't see. I remember looking at my watch at one point. It was around 2 in the morning, and thinking that the sun wouldn't be up for hours. Time was dragging, and every minute felt like an eternity. We tried to talk in whispers, but our voices sounded tiny against the sounds from the woods. One of my roommates suggested we get in the truck and just drive, but I was worried that if we moved away from the fire, whatever was out there would get us. So we stayed put, backs to the fire, facing outward like we were in some kind of old Western movie. But it wasn't heroic. It was terrifying. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It was constant, this heavy, oppressive sensation that something was right there in the trees, just beyond the light, studying us. I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. The woods were too dark to see into, but I could hear rustling sounds, like something big was moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the light rustle of a deer or a raccoon. It was heavier, more deliberate. Once, I thought I saw a shape, tall and dark, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, standing between 2 trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't say anything to the others because I didn't want to scare them more, but I know they felt it too. The stones kept coming, and the knocking and crying never let up. It was like whatever it was wanted to wear us down, to keep us on edge all night. And it worked. I don't think any of us slept a wink. We just sat there, jumping at every sound, our nerves completely shot. I must have checked the safety on my gun 100 times, my finger resting near the trigger, but I never fired it. What would I shoot at? There was nothing to see. As the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the sounds gradually stopped. The knocking faded away. The crying ceased, and no more stones came. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The woods went quiet, except for the normal morning sounds of birds chirping and the river flowing. We stayed by the fire until the sun was fully up, just to be safe. The relief was immense, but it was mixed with this deep, lingering fear. We were exhausted, our eyes red from lack of sleep, and we just wanted to get out of there. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, not talking much. Everything felt surreal in the daylight, like the night had been a bad dream. But then we went to take down the tent, and that's when we saw it. The ground around our camp was torn up, not just messed up, but destroyed. Deep gouges in the dirt, like something had been digging or dragging heavy objects, and there were piles of scat everywhere, big ones, the size of what you'd expect from a large bear, but it didn't look like bear scat. It was darker, and it had a foul smell that made my stomach turn. We found footprints too, but they were blurred, like whatever made them had been moving fast. We didn't stick around to investigate. We threw everything in the truck and drove out of there as fast as we could on the bumpy dirt road. None of us said a word for the first 10 minutes. Then, when we hit the paved road, one of my roommates finally spoke. "That wasn't a person," he said, and we all agreed. "There's no way a person could have done all that, thrown stones that hard, made those sounds, torn up the ground like that." We talked about it a little on the drive back, but mostly we were just quiet, lost in our own thoughts. To this day, I have no idea what it was. We've told the story a few times over the years, and it always gives me chills. I've never gone back to that spot on the Thompson River, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes when I'm camping somewhere else, I'll hear a strange noise at night, and my heart will start racing all over again. That night in October of 1998 is burned into my memory, and I still can't explain it. Story 5. I'll never forget that day. Not ever. It's burned into my brain, a memory that feels more like a brand. I was about 10 years old. My sibling, who's a couple years younger than me, was my whole world back then. We did everything together. We were out in the yard, the big one that wrapped around our house in rural Ohio. It was one of those long, lazy summer evenings where the air starts to get cool, but the ground is still warm from the sun. The game was darts. You know, those old yard darts with the metal tips. Our parents had an ancient set, the kind they'd probably never sell in a store today. We'd set up the plastic rings on opposite ends of the grass and spend hours trying to land the darts inside them. It was that time of day when the light gets all funny. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was gone behind the trees. So everything was bathed in this deep blue-grey twilight. The fireflies were just starting to blink on and off, little dots of gold in the shadows. I was leaning down to pick up a dart I'd thrown. It had stuck in the ground at a weird angle, and I had to wiggle it loose. My sibling was over by the other ring, complaining that I was taking too long. The air was so still, you could hear the buzz of the last few bugs of the day and the rustle of the big oak tree in the neighbor's yard. It was peaceful. Normal. The kind of normal you don't even think about until it's gone. I don't know what made me look up. There was no sound, no sudden movement. It was just a feeling, a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone had dropped an ice cube down my shirt. I straightened up and looked across the road. Our house sat on a quiet country lane, not much more than a strip of cracked asphalt, and directly across from us was a thick line of woods. It wasn't a friendly forest. It was dense, dark, a wall of leaves and shadows that seemed to swallow the light. And that's when I saw it. At the very edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, there was a figure. It was hunched over, partly hidden by the trunk of a big pine tree. It was using its hands. I remember this so clearly. It was using its hands to push two big branches apart, like it was peering out from behind a curtain. The shape of it was all wrong. It was too big to be a man, way too big, and it wasn't standing upright. It was crouched, but even crouching, it was huge. The shoulders were massive, sloping down to these long, thick arms. It was covered in hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear. It was dark, almost black, and looked wet, like it had been caught in the rain. My brain just short-circuited. It tried to file it under bear or weird guy in a coat, but it wouldn't fit. The proportions were unnatural. The legs were shorter than they should have been for something that tall, and the arms were so long. It looked powerful in a way that felt ancient and raw. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the grass. My heart wasn't even beating fast yet. It was like it had just stopped, frozen solid in my chest. All I could do was stare. My sibling must have seen the look on my face. They stopped their complaining and followed my gaze. I heard this little gasp, this tiny intake of breath that was pure fear. That sound broke my trance for a split second. I didn't turn my head. I didn't take my eyes off the thing in the woods. My mouth was dry as dust, but I managed to force the words out. It wasn't a scream. It was a choked, raspy whisper that was somehow loud enough to carry across the yard. Run, run inside. Now. The moment the words left my mouth, the thing stopped moving. It had been subtly adjusting its position, its head tilted like it was listening to something, but the second I made a sound, it froze completely, and then it turned its head. It looked right at us. That was the worst part, the absolute soul-crushing worst part. Before that, it was just a scary shape. When it looked at us, it became a thing that saw us. Its eyes, I'll see them until the day I die. They weren't glowing red or anything stupid like that. They were just dark, deep-set pits in its face, but they held an intelligence that was so cold, so alien, and so utterly focused on the two of us standing there in our own backyard. It wasn't the blank stare of a deer or the simple curiosity of a dog. This was a calculating look, a recognizing look. The fear that washed over me then was a physical thing. It was a weight that pressed down on my shoulders, so heavy I felt like I was going to be pushed right into the ground. My legs were trembling so hard, I was surprised they were still holding me up. My skin felt tight and cold, and every single hair on my body was standing straight up. I could feel the individual blades of grass under my sneakers. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, a whooshing sound like the ocean. I could smell the damp earth from where I'd pulled the dart out. We were both paralyzed. My sibling was just a blur of pale fear in the corner of my vision. We were two statues in our own yard, locked in a staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. The world had shrunk down to just the three of us, me, my sibling, and that thing across the road. The fireflies, the evening birds, the distant hum of a car, it all just vanished. There was only silence and that stare. It felt like we stood there for an hour, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. The creature didn't make a sound. It didn't snarl or roar. It just watched us with this intense, predatory stillness. It was the stillness that was the most terrifying. A bear would have moved, made a noise. A person would have shouted or waved. This thing was just waiting, assessing. Then some primal survival instinct, something deeper than thought, kicked in. It was like a switch flipped in my brain. My body unlocked. I didn't think, I need to run. My body just did it. I spun around, my legs feeling like jelly, and I grabbed my sibling's arm. I don't even know if I said anything else. I just yanked, and we both started running for the house. We didn't run in a straight line. We stumbled, our feet tangling, our breaths coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. I remember the feel of the cool metal screen door handle under my sweaty palm. I remember throwing my shoulder against the door, bursting into the kitchen, and the shock of the bright yellow electric light after the deep twilight outside. We collapsed on the linoleum floor, a heap of shaking limbs and terror. Our mom was at the sink. She turned around and her face just fell. "What in the world?" she said, her voice sharp with alarm. We were both white as ghosts. I know we were, because I could see the bloodless pallor of my sibling's face, and I could feel the same cold absence of blood in my own cheeks. We were crying, but it was the silent, breathless crying of sheer, unadulterated panic. We couldn't get the words out at first. We were just pointing back towards the door, towards the road. Finally, I managed to choke it out. "There's something in the woods, a monster." My sibling, still gasping, nodded frantically. "It was big and hairy. It looked at us." My mum tried to calm us down, her voice soft but her eyes wide. My dad came in from the living room, his brow furrowed. He was a practical man, a farmer's son. He listened to our jumbled, hysterical story about the huge, hunched-over thing that pushed the branches aside and stared right at us. He did what any good parent would do. He grabbed a big flashlight from the junk drawer and went outside. We watched from the window, our faces pressed against the cool glass. He walked out into the yard, sweeping the powerful beam of light across the road and into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks and leaves, but it couldn't penetrate the deep blackness between them. He stood there for a long time, just looking. He even walked across the road a little ways, peering into the gloom. When he came back inside, his face was serious but calm. "I don't see anything, kids," he said. He put a heavy hand on each of our shoulders. "It was probably just a bear. They can look awfully big and strange in the dark. Or maybe it was Mr. Henderson from down the road. He's been clearing some brush on his property line." We just shook our heads. We knew it wasn't a bear. A bear doesn't stand at the edge of the woods and use its hands to carefully part branches to look out. A bear doesn't have those long, powerful arms and that distinctly un-bear-like posture. And it sure as hell wasn't old Mr. Henderson. The thing we saw was built all wrong to be a person. The torso was too long. The way it hunched was too animalistic. They believed that we saw something. They never accused us of lying, but they offered us the rational explanations, the safe ones, the ones that let you sleep at night. A bear, a man in a dark coat, a trick of the light. We took the comfort they offered because we were just kids, and we were desperate for any explanation that didn't involve the reality of what we had witnessed. But we knew. My sibling and I, we looked at each other later that night, after we'd been put to bed, and we didn't have to say a word. The knowledge was right there, a shared, silent terror in our eyes. We had seen something that wasn't supposed to be real. The feeling of being watched didn't go away for weeks. I'd catch myself staring out my bedroom window at night, my heart in my throat, scanning the tree line for any movement. I never wanted to play in the yard at dusk again. That specific shade of twilight blue always brought the memory rushing back, a cold fist closing around my heart. And even now, all these years later, if my sibling and I ever talk about it, the same thing happens. Our voices get quiet. We get chills, real physical shivers that run down our spines, and our eyes, they get this watery look, like the fear is still so fresh, so close to the surface, that our bodies can't even contain it. It's not a story we tell for fun, it's a memory we carry, a heavy, cold stone of a memory, because I know what I saw. It was big, it was hairy, and it was hunched over. It used its hands to push the branches aside. And the moment I yelled, it stopped. It turned its head, and it stared right at us with a depth of awareness that I have never seen in any animal before or since. I don't care what anyone says. It was no bear. It was no man. I am convinced, down to the very core of my being, that we saw a Bigfoot, and the terror of that stare has never, ever faded. Story 6. Okay, I'll give this a shot. I don't talk about this much because honestly, who would believe me? But I saw something out there in the woods that day that changed how I see everything, and I guess writing it down might help, or at least get it off my chest. This was back in the late 90s. I want to say maybe 97 or 98. I was in my late 20s, I think. I'd grown up just outside of Aberdeen, Washington, and those woods were like my backyard. Still are, really. I'd been hunting since I was a kid, first with my dad and then on my own. I knew the sounds, the smells, the way the light falls through the trees at different times of day. I wasn't some city kid who got spooked by a raccoon. I knew what belonged out there and what didn't. It was a fall afternoon, one of those days that starts out gray and just gets grayer. It had been raining on and off for a week, so everything was soaked. The ground was a mess of wet leaves and mud, and the air had that cold, damp chill that gets right into your bones. The leaves were mostly down, so you could see further than usual, but everything was slick and dark. I'd had a rough week at work. I was doing construction at the time, and I just needed to get away from everything for a few hours. No people, no noise, just the woods. I decided to take a solo drive out on the logging roads near the Wuchi area. If you're from around there, you know the ones. They're rough, gravel roads that cut back deep into the hills, places where you're more likely to see a logging truck than another car. I threw my .30-30 rifle in the truck, more out of habit than anything else. Deer season was open, and even if I didn't see anything, it felt right to have it with me. It was a comfort thing, you know, like having your wallet or your keys. I drove for maybe 45 minutes, just me and the sound of the tires crunching on wet gravel. The radio was just static, so I turned it off. The silence was heavy, but it was the kind of silence I was looking for. It was getting on towards evening, that time when the light starts to go flat and the shadows get long. I remember looking at the clock on my dashboard. It was a little after 4 in the afternoon. It wouldn't be dark for a couple of hours, but under the thick canopy and with the cloud cover, it felt later. I pulled off onto a smaller spur road, one that was barely more than 2 ruts in the mud, and parked my truck near a big clear-cut area. The clear-cut was a few years old, so it was all regrowth, waist-high ferns, young alder trees, and a lot of blackberry brambles. It was ugly, but the deer liked the edges where the forest started again. I figured I'd sit for a while, see if anything moved. I got out of the truck, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It's a smell I know well. Wet earth, rotting leaves, and that faint, sweet smell of damp cedar. I remember the way the cold air felt in my lungs, sharp and clean. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and started walking up the edge of the clear cut, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The mud was so wet, it made a sucking sound with every step. I could feel the cold seeping through the leather of my boots after just a few minutes. I found a spot to sit on a big, moss-covered stump at the top of a slight rise. It gave me a good view down into the clear cut and across to the tree line on the other side, maybe 60, 70 yards away. The trees over there were old-growth big Douglas firs and hemlocks, dark and thick. I settled in, resting the rifle across my knees. The stump was wet, and I could feel the dampness creeping through my jeans almost immediately. I didn't care. I just sat there, breathing, watching my breath mist in the air. For the first 20 minutes or so, nothing happened. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. A few birds chirped somewhere far off, and the wind rustled the few dead leaves still clinging to the branches. I was just starting to feel that calm, that empty-headed peace I'd come out here for, and then I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a deer moving through the underbrush down below me in the clear cut. But it was different. It was a steady, rhythmic crunching, like something heavy was walking, but it was slower and more deliberate than a deer. It sounded bigger. I froze, my grip tightening on the rifle. My first thought was, okay, a buck, a big one. My heart started beating a little faster, that hunter's anticipation. I slowly crouched down, lower behind the stump, trying to make myself small. The sound was coming from the tree line directly across from me. I peered over the top of the stump, my eyes straining to see into the shadows between the trees. The light was fading fast now, turning everything a uniform shade of gray. The rain started up again, just a light drizzle, but it made the air feel even colder. I remember blinking the water out of my eyes, trying to focus. Then I saw movement, a shift in the shadows right at the edge of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a deer. Deer don't stand up. A figure stepped out from behind a giant fir tree. It was tall. So damn tall. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 1.5 feet taller than me, maybe more. It was standing fully upright on 2 legs, just like a man. But it wasn't a man. It was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but long, shaggy hair, dark brown and matted looking, like it was wet from the rain. Its shoulders were massive, incredibly broad, and its arms were freakishly long, hanging down past its knees. I remember staring at its arms, because that's what really sealed it for me. No bear has arms like that. No animal I've ever seen stands like that. It was about 60 yards away, just standing there at the tree line, half in shadow. It wasn't moving. It was just looking. And then it turned its head, and I knew with a cold certainty that dropped into my stomach like a stone that it was looking right at me. It had paused, and its head was aimed directly at my hiding spot. I couldn't see its eyes clearly from that distance in the poor light, but I could feel its gaze. It was an intelligence, not the dumb curiosity of a cow or the predatory focus of a cougar. This was a knowing look. It saw me, and it knew I saw it. That's when the fear hit me. Not just startled fear, but a deep, primal terror that felt like ice water flooding my veins. My whole body went rigid. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. My mind was screaming at me to raise my rifle, to get a sight picture, to do something, but my arms wouldn't listen. They were frozen. The rifle felt like it weighed 100 pounds on my knees. I was a hunter, sitting in the woods with a powerful rifle, and I felt completely and utterly helpless. I felt like prey. That's the only way to describe it. I was not the hunter anymore. I was something that was being watched. It stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. It didn't make a sound. No growl, no huff, no snapping of twigs. The woods were dead silent, except for the patter of the drizzle on the leaves. The silence from it was worse than any sound it could have made. Then it moved. It didn't run. It just took a step, a long, effortless stride that covered an insane amount of ground. Its movement was fluid and powerful, not clumsy or heavy. It moved along the slope parallel to the tree line, and it was fast, unnaturally fast for something that size. It wasn't crashing through the brush. It moved with a strange grace, its long arms swinging slightly at its sides. I watched, still frozen as it took 3, maybe 4 of those huge strides. It was heading for a denser part of the forest where the trees grew close together. It didn't look back at me, it just went, and then it was gone. It stepped between 2 big firs and vanished into the shadows like it had never been there. I stayed crouched behind that stump for I don't know how long. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. I was shaking, a full-body tremble that started deep in my core and rattled my teeth. The cold I'd felt before was nothing compared to the cold dread that was sitting in my gut. Finally, I forced myself to stand up. My legs were wobbly, and I had to put a hand on the wet stump to steady myself. I was still gripping my rifle, my knuckles white. I looked down at my hands and saw they were trembling. I'm not a guy who shakes. I've had close calls with bears. I've been in fights. I've had near misses on the highway. Nothing had ever made me react like that. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. The forest was just a wall of dark trees again. The rain was a little heavier now, soaking through my jacket. I could smell the wet wool of my coat and my own sweat. A sharp, sour smell of fear. I didn't even think about hunting. The idea of tracking a deer, of being quiet and still in these woods, suddenly seemed insane. I just wanted to be back in my truck, with the doors locked, even though I knew a lock wouldn't mean a thing to what I'd just seen. I turned and started walking back, my steps hurried and clumsy. I kept looking over my shoulder, my head on a swivel, expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The woods, which had always been a place of comfort, felt alien and hostile. I got to my truck, fumbled with the keys, and practically threw myself inside. I slammed the door and locked it, my breathing still ragged. I just sat there for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I looked at my rifle lying on the passenger seat. For the first time in my life, it didn't make me feel safe. It felt like a toy. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was back on the paved road, the headlights cutting through the twilight. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I've seen bears, cougars, bobcats, every kind of wildlife we have around here. I know what they look like, how they move, how they sound. What I saw that day wasn't any of them. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. But I saw it with my own eyes. I felt the fear it put in me, a fear that's still there, right under the surface, every time I walk into the deep woods now. And that's it. That's what happened to me that evening near the Wuchi area. I've never seen it again, and I don't know if I want to. Some things you just can't explain, and that's one of them. Story 7. Okay, I'll try to write this the way you asked. I'm still not over it, to be honest. Just typing this out makes my hands feel cold, and my heart starts beating faster. It happened last autumn, I think it was late October, because the leaves were all these fiery colors, but starting to fall and get soggy on the ground. My husband and I were driving home from visiting his sister over in Maggie Valley. We live near Asheville, and instead of taking the main highway back, which can get clogged with tourist traffic, he decided to take a shortcut. He'd done it a few times before, he said. It was this winding 2-lane road that cuts right across the mountain, following the Pigeon River for most of the way. It was getting on towards late afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the taller peaks, throwing long, deep shadows across the road, but it wasn't full dark yet. That kind of gloomy, in-between time of day. We were in our Jeep Wrangler, the green one. I was in the passenger seat, just kind of zoning out, watching the river churn and foam over the rocks below. The road was empty, I mean completely empty. We hadn't seen another car for maybe 20 minutes. It was just us, the sound of the tires on the asphalt, and the river noise. We came around a bend, and on the right-hand side of the road, down in the ditch but right up near the shoulder, I saw this figure. My first thought, and I swear this is what I thought, was that it was a man, a really, really tall man, kneeling down or hunched over, maybe looking for something in the ditch. He was all in dark colors, maybe a black coat or something, but even in that split second as we passed him, something felt off. The way he was hunched was wrong. It wasn't a comfortable human crouch. It was more like a squat, a powerful, coiled sort of squat, and he was just so broad across the back. We flew past him. I remember the whoomp sound of the air as we went by. I turned my head to my husband. "Did you see that?" I asked him. "See what?" he said, his eyes still on the road. "That guy on the side of the road. He looked weird." My husband, he's a curious guy, doesn't like loose ends. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and I did the same, twisting in my seat to look out the back window. The road behind us was empty for a second, just the grey asphalt snaking back into the trees. And then I saw it. The figure was no longer in the ditch. It was standing right in the middle of our lane. It had stood up in the time it took us to pass it and look back, and that's when my brain just broke. Because it wasn't a man. It was so much taller than a man. It had to be 9 feet tall, easy, and it wasn't wearing a black coat. It was black, or a very, very dark brown. It was covered, and I mean completely covered, in this long, shaggy hair. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing us, watching our Jeep drive away. The proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. The shoulders were impossibly wide, like a football player in full pads, but this was all muscle and fur. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, just a darker patch where a face should be. But I could feel it looking at us. I could feel its attention like a physical weight. My breath just left my body. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. I made a sound, a little gasping squeak. "Oh my God," my husband whispered. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "What the hell is that?" "Don't stop," I managed to say, my voice tight and high. "Just keep driving. Go, go!" He accelerated. The Jeep's engine growled, and we picked up speed, putting distance between us and that thing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the back window. It just stood there, getting smaller and smaller, until we went around another bend and it was gone from view. I slumped back into my seat, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. I was trembling all over, a fine, uncontrollable shake in my hands and legs. My mouth was dry as dust. "We have to go back," my husband said. His voice was low, intense. "Are you insane?" I shrieked at him. I never shriek at him. I was absolutely frantic. "No, absolutely not. We are not going back." "I have to see," he said, and his tone had that stubborn finality I know all too well. I have to know what that was. It could have been someone in a costume, some idiot playing a prank. "This isn't a prank area," I yelled. "There's no one out here. Did you see how tall it was? Did you see how it moved? It stood up like it was nothing." "It was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. He sounded scared, and him being scared just made me 10 times more terrified. "It was not a bear," I said, my voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You know it wasn't a bear." He was already slowing down, looking for a place to turn around. The road was narrow, with a steep drop-off on the riverside. My panic was turning into a cold, sharp dread that settled in my stomach. I felt like I was going to be sick. "Please," I begged him, "please just keep going. Let's just go home." "I can't," he said, and he found a slightly wider spot in the road, a pull-off for fishermen. He cranked the wheel and executed a tight 3-point turn. The Jeep lurched. Now we were facing back the way we came. I think I started to cry then. Silent tears just started rolling down my cheeks. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away, to put as many miles between us and that thing as possible. And we were driving right towards it. He drove slower this time, much slower. The Jeep crept along. The woods on either side of the road seemed darker, thicker, more menacing. Every shadow looked like it could move. Every tree trunk looked like a leg. The sound of the river was no longer peaceful. It was a roaring noise that could hide any other sound. We came around the bend. The spot where we'd seen it was just ahead, on the left now, and it was still there. It wasn't in the road anymore. It was back off the shoulder, maybe 15-20 feet into the tree line, but it was standing there, fully in the open, just watching the road, waiting. My husband brought the Jeep to a complete stop. We were maybe 100 feet away from it. The engine idled, a rough, shaky sound. It was even bigger than I'd thought. It was massive. The height was one thing, but the bulk was something else. It had to be 400-500 pounds of pure muscle. Its chest was like a barrel. The hair wasn't short and sleek like a bear's. It was long and shaggy, matted in places, hanging off its body in thick cords. It was a deep, solid black from its head to its feet. I still couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see the shape of its head, kind of conical, and I got the impression of a heavy brow ridge. It didn't move. It just stood there, one of its huge long arms hanging at its side, the other slightly bent. It was utterly, profoundly still. It wasn't making a sound. No growl, no huff, nothing. Just silence. And then my husband did the stupidest, most terrifying thing he has ever done in his entire life. He put the Jeep in park. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "I just want a better look," he said, and he undid his seatbelt. No. I reached for his arm, but he was already opening his door. The interior dome light didn't come on, thank God. We had it switched off. The sound of the door opening seemed incredibly loud in the quiet. "Get back in the car!" I shouted, my voice cracking with pure fear. "Get back in right now!" He didn't listen. He stepped out, leaving his door open, and took 1-2 steps forward. So he was standing just in front of the Jeep's hood. He was frozen there, just staring. I could see his profile. His mouth was hanging open. He was stunned, completely stunned by the sheer size of the thing. From my seat, I had a perfect, horrifying view. The creature and my husband, standing in the middle of this deserted mountain road, facing each other. The creature seemed to be looking right at him. I could feel its focus shift from the vehicle to my husband. The air felt thick, charged, like before a lightning strike. I was paralyzed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch this nightmare play out. My husband, a 6-foot-tall man, looked like a child next to this thing. It made him look small and fragile. The creature still didn't move, but its head tilted, just a fraction. Just a slight, curious tilt. And that tiny movement was more threatening than any charge. It was intelligence. It was assessment. That broke my paralysis. I scrambled over the center console into the driver's seat. My legs were like jelly, and I banged my knee hard on the gear shift, but I didn't even feel the pain. I was sobbing. Proper, gasping sobs now. I fumbled for the gear shift, my vision blurry with tears. It was still in park. I yanked it into drive. My husband heard the clunk of the transmission. He finally turned his head, and he saw me in the driver's seat, my face a mess of tears and snot and terror. "Get in!" I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, primal sound. "Get in now!" That finally got through to him. The spell was broken. He moved fast, lunging back towards the open door. He practically fell into his seat, pulling the door shut with a heavy slam. "Go!" he yelled, and his voice was full of the same terror I was feeling. I didn't need to be told twice. I stomped on the gas pedal. The Jeep's tires squealed and spat gravel from the shoulder. We shot forward. I didn't care about the narrow road or the drop-off. I just had to get away. As we sped past the spot, I couldn't help but look. I had to. It was still standing there in the trees, but as we flew by, its head turned. It tracked us with its gaze. I still couldn't see its eyes, but I knew it was watching us leave. It didn't chase us. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, a monstrous, silent sentinel in the deepening shadows of the woods, and watched us run. I didn't let up on the gas until we hit the main highway, maybe 15 minutes later. I was driving like a maniac, taking the curves way too fast, the Jeep leaning hard. My husband was dead silent, just staring straight ahead, his face pale and waxy. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We got home. We didn't talk about it for 2 days. When we finally did, our voices were hushed like we were afraid something might hear us. We looked up stuff online, found forums with other people's stories. The descriptions matched, the feeling matched, that cold, primal fear. We never went back to that road, we never will. My husband doesn't suggest shortcuts anymore. We stick to the highways, with the other cars and the bright lights. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes, that huge dark shape standing perfectly still in the trees, the way it just watched us. Not with anger, not with curiosity really. It's hard to explain. It was just awareness. It was aware of us in a way that felt ancient and completely alien. It knew we were there, and it knew we were afraid, and it just didn't care. We were just something that had passed through its world. And sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and I wonder if it's still out there, standing, watching, and I wonder if it remembers us too. Story 8. It was one of those late September afternoons where the air starts getting that crisp edge to it, the kind that makes you feel more awake than you normally would. I'd promised my daughter and her friend I'd take them out after school. My daughter was 9, her friend had just turned 10. They were at that age where riding bikes was the absolute peak of freedom, and our quiet rural road in Pennsylvania was perfect for it. The plan was simple. I'd go for my jog, and they'd ride their bikes a little ways ahead of me. Not too far, just enough that they felt independent, but I could still see them. The road we were on, it's not even really a road you'd find on most maps. It's paved, but it's narrow, cracked in places with weeds pushing up through the asphalt. Woods press in on both sides, a thick wall of oak and pine that's already turning, splashes of red and yellow against the deep green. The houses aren't really houses you see from the road. They're set way back at the ends of long gravel driveways, sometimes just a mailbox and a glimpse of a roof through the trees. You can run for half a mile and not see a single other person. That's why I liked it. The quiet, the keep. We'd started from our driveway, me doing my little stretches against the mailbox, the girls already wobbling off, their backpacks stuffed with after-school snacks still strapped to their backs. The sound was just the crunch of my shoes on the gravel shoulder, the hum of the bike tires on the pavement, and their laughter. Normal kid stuff. They were talking about some video or something. I wasn't really listening, just keeping an eye on them, feeling the burn in my legs as I settled into a rhythm. We were probably about a mile from the house, around a gentle bend where the trees get even thicker. The sunlight was coming through the canopy in these long, slanting rays, making everything look kind of golden. That's when I saw it, up ahead on the left side of the road, maybe 100 yards in front of the girls. There was a figure. It was just standing there, right at the edge, where the asphalt meets the dirt and the weeds, its back completely turned to us. My first thought, and it was a totally normal thought, was that it was a person. A big person. Someone wearing one of those bulky hooded winter coats, even though it wasn't that cold. Maybe a hunter in camouflage, but it was so still, unnaturally still. You know how people are always shifting their weight, scratching their head, something. This thing was like a statue. I remember my pace slowing just a little, not from fear, but from curiosity. It was odd. The girls were still pedaling, closing the distance, maybe 70 yards now, 50. I could hear the clicking of their bike chains. I kept waiting for the figure to move, to hear us and turn around. Nothing. It was when the girls got to within about 40, maybe 30 yards of it, that the first real trickle of something cold went down my spine. The proportions were wrong. This wasn't just a big guy in a coat. The shoulders were way too broad and they sloped down into these huge, long arms. The legs were thick like tree trunks, and the color, it wasn't a jacket color. It was a reddish, brownish color, like rust or old brick, and it wasn't smooth. It was shaggy, patchy. In some spots, it looked almost thin, like an old matted carpet. My jog had slowed to a walk. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The girls were still chattering, completely oblivious, probably 30 yards away now. They were going to ride right past it, and then it turned around. It wasn't a fast movement, it wasn't jerky, it was this slow, deliberate pivot, like it had known we were there the whole time and had just decided to acknowledge us. And when its face came into view, my brain just broke. For a second, it refused to process what I was seeing. It was a face, but it wasn't a human face. It was hairless, this dark, leathery, weathered skin like old saddle leather. The brow was heavy, jutting out, and underneath it were these deep-set eyes. They weren't glowing red or anything crazy like in the movies. They were just dark, intelligent, and they were locked right on me. The sheer size of it hit me all at once. This thing was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and it absolutely dwarfed me. 7 feet tall, easy, maybe more, and it had to be 500 pounds of pure, solid mass. It wasn't fat, it was power. Its chest was like a barrel, and those shoulders. I've seen big guys at the gym, strongmen competitors on TV, and this was something else entirely. It was a different kind of build, primal and raw. The worst part was the silence. It didn't make a sound, no growl, no huff, no rustle of leaves. It just stood there, looking at me, and then it took a step forward. It wasn't a charge, it wasn't aggressive, it was just a step onto the road, like it was coming to meet us. That's when the fear exploded in my chest. It wasn't just being scared, it was this primal, gut-level terror that flooded my system with ice. My heart wasn't just pounding, it felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of my ribcage. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to grab the girls and just sprint. But some other part of my brain, the dad part, took over. It was like a switch flipped. If I screamed, if I panicked, the girls would panic. They would look, and if they saw that thing, they would freeze or scream, and that might trigger it. I couldn't let that happen. I forced my voice to be calm. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. My throat was so tight with fear, I could barely get the air out. "Hey, girls," I said, and I'm still amazed at how level it sounded. "Time to head back. Turn your bikes around now, let's go." My daughter, God bless her, just said, "Okay, Dad," in that sing-song voice kids use. She didn't question it. Her friend started to say, "But we just got," and I cut her off, a little sharper this time. "Now, please," they maneuvered their bikes in the road, the awkward little three-point turns kids do. The whole time, I never took my eyes off the creature. It had taken another step. It was just walking, a slow, steady, purposeful walk directly towards us. Its arms hung down by its sides, long enough that its fingers, I could see them now, were thick and seemed to curl slightly. It still made no noise. Its feet, whatever they were, didn't make a sound on the pavement. That detail is burned into my mind. Something that big should have made a sound. I moved, putting myself directly between the girls and it. I started walking backwards, my eyes glued to it. I didn't run. I remember telling myself, "Don't run. Running is what prey does." I just kept a steady, deliberate pace backwards, my arms out slightly like I was herding the girls, who were now pedaling back the way we came. The creature kept walking forward. The distance was closing. It was maybe 25 yards away now. I could see more details. The way the reddish hair on its arms was thinner, showing that same dark, leathery skin underneath. The sheer bulk of its neck, or what should have been its neck. It was so thick and powerful it seemed to blend right into its torso. Its eyes never left mine. There was no anger in them, no curiosity even. It was just a look, an assessment. It was studying me. The girls were picking up speed, their little legs pumping. I think my calm act was starting to wear thin because they could feel the tension. They weren't talking anymore. The only sounds were the bikes, my own ragged breathing, and the blood roaring in my ears. 15 yards. I could smell it now. This is a detail I'll never forget. It's why I know this was real. It wasn't a gross smell, not like a skunk or a dead animal. It was a smell I can't really describe. Musky, earthy, like wet dirt and old leaves and something else. Something wild and animal. but not like a dog or a bear. It was a smell I'd never encountered before, and it hung in the air around us, this heavy, pungent scent that made the back of my throat feel thick. 10 yards. This was the most terrifying moment. It was close enough that I could see the texture of the skin on its face, the lines and creases. It was so close I could have thrown a rock and hit it. Its eyes were deep brown, almost black, and in them I saw nothing. No soul, no malice, no friendliness, just a profound, ancient emptiness. It was like looking into the eyes of a mountain. It just was. I was still walking backwards, my legs feeling like rubber, my back tensed for the moment it would lunge. I expected to feel its hand on me. I expected it to make a sound, but it didn't. It just kept walking, matching our retreat pace for pace, a silent, massive shadow herding us down the road. The girls were ahead of me now, and the bend in the road was coming up. I knew if we could just get around that bend, we'd be out of its direct line of sight. I risked a glance over my shoulder, just a quick one. The road behind us was clear. "Keep going, don't stop," I said to the girls, my voice a harsh whisper now. I looked back at the creature. It was still there, still walking. It had closed the distance to maybe 8 yards. I could see its chest moving, a slow, deep rhythm. It was breathing. The reality of that this was a living, breathing thing, made my stomach lurch. Then we reached the bend. The second the girls disappeared around it, I turned around and started to jog properly, still backwards for a few steps, keeping my eyes on the spot where it would reappear. I saw its shoulder, its arm, as it came around the bend. It was still following. "Faster, girls! A little faster!" I called out, no longer able to keep the panic completely out of my voice. I turned and ran properly then, a slow, measured run, constantly looking back over my shoulder. It was still there, a huge reddish-brown shape, moving with that same silent, unstoppable gait. It wasn't running either. It was just walking, but its walk was covering ground almost as fast as my jog. This went on for what felt like an eternity. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My mouth was dry as dust. Every time I looked back, it was there, a constant looming presence. We passed a driveway, and for a wild second I thought about running up to a house, banging on a door. But what if no one was home? What if we were trapped between the house and this thing? The road felt like the only option. The highway was our goal. There would be cars there, people. The woods started to thin out a little. I could see glimpses of the main highway up ahead, the flash of a car in the sunlight. Hope, sharp and painful, stabbed through me. I looked back one more time. It had stopped. It was just standing in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards behind us now. It was no longer walking. It was just watching us go. Its massive form was silhouetted against the dappled light of the trees. "Don't look back. Just keep going," I yelled to the girls, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to keep looking at it, to make sure it wasn't still coming. We burst out onto the shoulder of the main highway. The sound was a shock, cars whizzing by, the roar of engines, the normality of it all was almost dizzying. A truck blasted its horn as it passed us, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The girls finally stopped their bikes, their faces pale and confused. "Dad, what was that? Why did we have to run?" my daughter asked, her voice trembling. I was bent over, hands on my knees, sucking in huge gulps of air. I couldn't answer her. I just looked back down the little rural road we'd just fled. It was empty, quiet. The creature was gone. We stood there for a few minutes, just breathing, the three of us. I kept staring down that road, half expecting to see it step out of the shadows. Nothing. I finally got myself together enough to tell the girls we saw a big animal, a bear maybe, and that it was better to be safe. They bought it. Kids are resilient. I never saw it again. I went back the next day in my truck, in broad daylight, with a friend. We walked that entire stretch of road. We searched the shoulders, the dirt, the edges of the woods where it had been standing, We found nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no hair snagged on a bush, nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. But it was. I know what I saw. I know the smell that filled my nose. I know the feeling of those dark, empty eyes locked onto mine. I know the sheer, paralyzing terror of having something that powerful, that unknown, just decide to walk toward you. It wasn't a monster from a movie. It was something else, something real. And the most chilling part, the thing that haunts me late at night, isn't that it chased us. It's that it didn't. It just escorted us out, and I have no idea why. Story 9. My companion and I were driving home after spending the day at a friend's place out near the outskirts of town. We'd been there for a barbecue, but the weather turned nasty early, so we left around 8 o'clock. The rain wasn't just drizzling, it was coming down in sheets, the kind that makes the roads slick and the visibility crap. I was behind the wheel of my old pickup truck, and my friend was in the passenger seat. We'd taken this route 100 times before. It's a 2-lane highway that cuts through some wooded areas, mostly pine forests and swamps, with long stretches where there's nothing but darkness on either side, no streetlights, just the occasional glow from a distant house or a passing car. The wipers were going full tilt, swishing back and forth, but they could barely keep up. The sound was rhythmic, almost soothing in a way, but it also made everything feel more isolated. We had the heater on to fight the chill, and the radio was playing some low-key music, but neither of us was really paying attention. We were both tired, just wanting to get home, dry off, and crash. I remember my hands were gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, because the road was getting slippery, and I could feel the tires hydroplaning every now and then. My friend was dozing off, head leaning against the window, but I was wide awake, focused on the road ahead. It was around 9 o'clock when we hit a particularly dark stretch. The trees were crowding in on both sides, their branches swaying in the wind, and the rain was coming down so hard that the headlights only pierced through about 50 feet or so. Everything beyond that was just a wall of grey and black. I remember feeling a little uneasy, not for any specific reason, just that primal kind of alertness you get when you're alone in the dark. My eyes were scanning the road, watching for deer or anything that might dart out, because that's common around here. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. On the right side of the road, maybe 30 yards ahead, there was this tall figure standing just off the shoulder. At first, I thought it was a person. Maybe someone broke down or was hitchhiking. But as we got closer, my brain just couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was huge, way taller than any person I've ever seen. I'd guess it was about 7.5 feet tall, maybe even more, and it was just standing there, poised, like it was about to step onto the highway. The rain was pouring down, but this thing wasn't moving, wasn't flinching. It was like a statue, but alive. As we drove closer, the headlights caught more details, and that's when the fear started to crawl up my spine. Its body was covered in this long, matted hair that looked yellowish in the light, all tangled and wet from the rain. It wasn't like any animal hair I've seen. It was thick and shaggy, almost like old straw, and it hung down in clumps. But the weirdest part was what looked like a tarp draped over its shoulders, not wrapped around it like a coat, but just sitting there, like it had been thrown on and stuck. The tarp was dark, maybe black or dark green, and it was flapping a little in the wind, but the thing underneath didn't seem to care. Its posture was what really got me. It was standing upright, like a person, but its arms were long and dangling, and it had this slight forward lean, like it was ready to bolt across the road. I couldn't see its face clearly because of the rain and the distance, but I got the impression of something not human. There was no hat, no jacket, just that hairy body and the tarp, and it was so still it was unnatural. My heart started pounding in my chest, hard and fast, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty on the wheel. I remember my breath catching in my throat, and I must have slowed down a bit without even thinking, because my friend stirred awake. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, and then he saw it too. I didn't have to say anything. I just glanced at him, and his face went pale. His eyes widened, and he leaned forward, staring out the windshield. We were maybe 20 yards away now, close enough to see that this wasn't some trick of the light or a shadow. This was real, solid, and it was watching the road. Not us specifically, but the highway, like it was waiting for a gap in traffic or something, but there was no traffic. It was just us. The moment we passed it, time seemed to slow down. We were going maybe 30 miles an hour because I'd eased off the gas, and as we drove by, I got a clearer look. The hair wasn't just yellow. It had a dirty, almost greasy look to it, and it was so long that it draped over parts of the tarp. The tarp itself was ragged, like it had been torn or worn out, and it was secured somehow, but I couldn't see how. The figure's shoulders were broad, and it had a muscular build, but it was lean, not bulky. And the smell, oh God, the smell hit us even through the closed windows. It was this foul, musky odor, like wet dog and rotten earth mixed together, so strong it made my stomach turn. I remember wrinkling my nose, and my friend did the same, both of us without saying a word. As we passed, I saw its head turn slightly, and I swear it looked right at us. I didn't see eyes, just dark patches under all that hair, but I felt this intense, predatory gaze that made my skin crawl. It wasn't curious or friendly, it was cold, calculating, like we were prey or an obstacle. My whole body went rigid, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. My friend let out this low gasp, and I knew he felt it too. That wave of fear, it wasn't just scare, it was deep, primal terror, the kind that roots you to the spot. For a second, I thought it might chase us or something, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching us go. The second we were past it, I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing on the wet pavement, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst, and my hands were trembling on the wheel. I kept my eyes glued to the road, but in the rearview mirror I saw the figure still standing there, fading into the darkness behind us. My friend was breathing heavily, and he finally spoke, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, and I just shook my head. I didn't have an answer. We drove in silence for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. The rain kept pounding, and the wipers kept swishing, but the cozy atmosphere from before was gone. Now, every shadow outside felt threatening. Every noise from the engine or the wind made me jump. I kept expecting to see it again, maybe ahead of us or beside the road, but nothing happened. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize it. Was it a bear? No, bears don't stand that tall or have hair like that. A person in a costume? But who would be out in this weather, in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? And the size? It was too big, too unnatural. After a while, my friend said, "We should go back." He sounded uncertain, like he didn't really mean it. I looked at him, and his face was still pale, his knuckles white where he was gripping the door handle. I shook my head again. "No way," I said, my voice rough. "I'm not turning around." And he didn't argue. We both knew, without saying it, that whatever that thing was, we didn't want to see it again. The fear was too raw, too intense. It was like our instincts were screaming at us to get away, to put as much distance between us and it as possible. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I drove faster than I should have, taking curves too tight, my eyes darting to every movement in the periphery. Every time we passed a clump of trees or a ditch, I half expected to see it standing there, waiting. My friend stayed quiet, just staring out the window, and I could tell he was as spooked as I was. When we finally pulled into my driveway, it was after 10 o'clock, and the rain had let up a little. We sat in the truck for a minute, not saying anything, just listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. The fear hadn't faded. If anything, it felt heavier, like a weight on my chest. I got out, and the cool night air hit me, but it didn't feel refreshing. It felt charged, like something was still out there. My friend followed me inside and we both avoided talking about it at first. We made some coffee, but neither of us could drink it. Our hands were still shaking. Eventually we sat down at the kitchen table and he looked at me and said, "You saw it too, right? The hair? The tarp?" I nodded and we started comparing notes quietly, like we were afraid someone might overhear. His description matched mine exactly. The height, the yellowish hair, the tarp, the way it stood. That confirmation made it worse, because it meant it was real, not some shared hallucination or trick of the light. We talked for a bit, trying to make sense of it, but we couldn't. The more we thought about it, the more it freaked us out. Why was it there? What was it doing? The tarp thing was especially weird. It didn't fit with any animal I know, and it made the whole thing feel even more unnatural, like it was using something human, but it wasn't human. After a while, my friend left, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there in the rain, that tall, hairy figure with the tarp over its shoulders, just waiting. The next day, I woke up feeling exhausted, and the first thing I thought about was that road. I knew I couldn't drive on it again. Not then, not ever. For the next few months, I took longer routes to get anywhere, adding extra time to my trips just to avoid that stretch of highway. My friend did the same. We never talked about it much after that night, but it was always there, hanging between us. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder when I was driving at night, or I'd get a whiff of something musky and my heart would skip a beat. I still don't know what it was. Bigfoot, some kind of creature. I've heard stories, but I never believed them until now. All I know is that on that rainy night in Florida, we saw something that shouldn't exist, and the fear it instilled in me is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. Story 10. It was the second week of October 1998. I'd been guiding for years out of the Allagash, and I thought I'd seen everything the Maine woods could throw at a person. I was wrong. This trip, this one specific day, is burned into my head. I can still smell the wet pine and the cold dirt. I can still feel that hard knot of fear right under my ribs, tight like a fist. We were based out of Old River Camp, a decent spot, not too far from the river, but deep enough to feel properly remote. The party was a group of 3 guys from Massachusetts, experienced enough hunters, but city experienced, you know. They knew their rifles, but not the woods, not really. The first few days were normal. We saw some sign, found some good spots, but then things started to get off. It started with the tracks. We were following a game trail a couple miles northeast of camp, looking for moose sign. The ground was soft from a recent rain, a thick carpet of damp leaves and mud. I was in the lead, and I just stopped dead. There was a print, but it wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear. It was a foot. A bare foot, but huge. I mean impossibly huge, longer than my boot by half again and wide, splayed out like a man's foot, but primitive. The stride between them was what got me, though. I'm over 6 feet tall, and I had to take a big lunging step to get from the back of one print to the front of the next. Whatever made these was moving with a purpose, covering ground in a way nothing on 2 legs should be able to. One of the guys, the one with the expensive binoculars, he just whistled low. What in God's name is that, Mike? I didn't have an answer. I crouched down, my knees popping, and just stared. The detail was chilling. You could see the ball of the foot, the individual toes. It was so clear. I remember the mud had oozed back in around the edges, but the center was deep. This thing was heavy. I felt a cold trickle down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I tried to play it cool, said it was probably a weird bear track, distorted by the mud. But I knew. I've seen 1,000 bear tracks. This wasn't a bear. Later that same day, we came across more sign branches. Not broken from someone brushing past them, but snapped and high up. I'm talking 8, 9 feet off the ground, clean breaks, green wood showing white in the gloom. Something had just reached up and snapped them like twigs. It was as if something massive was moving through the canopy, or was just so damn tall it didn't care about the undergrowth. We also found drag marks. Long, shallow grooves in the forest floor, and caught in the rough bark of a fallen log nearby were a few coarse, dark hairs. They were thick, like boar bristles, but longer and black as pitch. I pocketed a couple without really thinking, my fingers feeling numb. The mood of the party had shifted completely. The joking had stopped. Now it was just the sound of our breathing and the crunch of our boots, and everyone was looking into the shadows between the trees, not at the game trails. The terror, the real deep-seated kind, started to build in the afternoon. The sun was getting low, casting long, distorted shadows that made every stump look like a crouching man. We were skirting a dense thicket of young spruce when the guy with the binoculars, his name was Jeff, grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. He didn't say a word, just pointed, his face pale. I followed his line of sight. Maybe 60, 70 yards away, moving parallel to us through a stand of tall pines, was a figure. It was hunched, but even hunched it was immense. The shoulders were unbelievably broad, tapered down to a narrower waist. It was moving swiftly, a fluid, powerful motion that was almost a lope, but it was covering ground so fast it was hard to track. It was dark, a matte blackish brown that blended into the shadows, but you could see the sheer mass of it, the way its muscles moved under its own weight. It didn't look at us, it just moved, a shadow among the trees, and then it was gone, vanished into the deeper woods. It was there for maybe 3 seconds, 4 at most. The silence that followed was heavier than any I'd ever felt. One of the other guys, the youngest, just started whispering, "No, no, no," over and over again. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to get out. My mouth was dry. We all just stood there, frozen for a full minute, maybe more. The woods, which usually felt so alive with little sounds, had gone utterly quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "We're following it," I said, and my voice came out as a croak. I don't know why I said it. Maybe it was professional pride, maybe it was some stupid primal curiosity, but the fear was now mixed with a desperate need to know, to have proof. The tracks were easy to find. They led away from where we'd seen the thing, and they led us to a kill site. It was a deer, a good-sized white-tailed buck, or what was left of it. It hadn't been eaten so much as it had been torn apart. The ribs were splayed open, the spine was snapped, and the head was twisted at an impossible angle. The ground was churned up into a bloody muck, and there, right in the middle of the worst of it, sunk deep into the mud, was a single perfect print, massive, the same foot. It was pressed so deep you could have poured water into it and made a perfect plaster cast. The sight of that peaceful-looking print in the middle of all that violent carnage made my stomach turn. This wasn't a scavenger, this was a predator. That was the moment the hunt ended. We weren't hunters anymore, we were prey. I looked at the guys, and I saw my own terror reflected in their faces. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw animal fear. "We're going back to camp," I said. "Now, we're not stopping." The hike back was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig made us jump. Every rustle in the leaves sounded like a footstep. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach for us. We moved as fast as we could without running, because running felt like admitting something, like triggering a chase. The sun dipped below the trees, and the twilight was a deep, cold blue. By the time we stumbled into the clearing of Old River Camp, it was full dark. We were all shaking, from cold and from fear. We got a fire going, a big, roaring one, and we huddled around it. Nobody talked about what we'd seen. We just stared into the flames, drinking coffee that tasted like ash, our rifles leaning against our knees, not for hunting, but for... something else. The normal night sounds eventually came back, the peepers, the distant call of an owl. It was almost worse. It felt like a trick. Then maybe a couple of hours after full dark, the woods went silent again. Not gradually, all at once. It was like someone had thrown a switch. The fire was the only sound, crackling and spitting. We all looked at each other. We all heard it. Then we heard the steps. They were heavy. Not the light, cautious steps of a deer or a coyote. These were slow, deliberate, thumping steps. Each one was a solid impact on the forest floor. Thump, a pause. Thump, another pause. They were coming from the tree line just beyond the ring of light from our fire. They were circling us. My blood went cold. I could feel the hair on my arms and the back of my neck standing up. One of the guys fumbled with his rifle, the metallic click of the safety sounding obscenely loud. "Don't," I whispered. "Just don't." The steps kept circling. Thump. Pause. Thump. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots. It was getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of a small branch. It was right there, just outside the light. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the guide in me, the need to protect my clients. Maybe it was just a final, stupid burst of courage. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely light the old kerosene lantern we kept for emergencies. The flame sputtered to life, casting a wobbly yellow globe of light around me. "Mike, what are you doing?" One of the guys hissed, his voice tight with panic. I didn't answer. I took a step away from the fire toward the tree line, then another. I held the lantern up high, my arm trembling, and I saw it. It was standing between two thick pine trees, maybe 30 feet away. It was tall, so damn tall, 7.5 feet, maybe 8. It was just standing there, perfectly still, watching us. The lantern light caught the sheen on its broad, hunched shoulders, the thick, powerful arms that hung down past its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was in shadow, but I could see the shape of its head, blocky and set directly on its shoulders with no real neck. But the worst part, the part that stops my breath even now, was the sound. In the sudden, absolute silence, I could hear it breathing, a slow, deep, rhythmic sound, like a bellows. Hoo! Shh! Hoo! Shh! And I could see it. In the cold October air, with each exhale, a plume of vapor, faint and white, drifted out from where its face would be, caught in the lantern light before fading into the dark. It just stood there, watching, breathing. It felt like an hour. It was probably 10 seconds. My whole body was locked up. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, holding this stupid, shaking lantern, staring at this thing that had no business existing in my world. Then, without a sound, it moved. It didn't turn around. It didn't run. It just faded. It took a single, slow step back, deeper into the shadows between the pines, and it was gone. The darkness just swallowed it. The heavy footsteps didn't start up again. It was just gone. The forest sounds didn't come back that night. We didn't sleep. We sat with our backs to the fire, staring out into the black, until the first grey light of dawn touched the sky. We packed our gear in a frantic, silent hurry. We didn't care about the tents. We just stuffed our packs and got out. We left without harvesting any animals. The hunt was the furthest thing from our minds. The evidence was all there, in my head and in my little notebook. The tracks with the impossible stride, the snapped branches way over my head, the drag marks and the coarse, dark hairs I still had in my pocket, the torn-apart deer, and the sight of that tall, broad-shouldered shape, its slow, visible breath hanging in the air as it watched us from the trees. We never spoke about it again after we got back to the truck. There was nothing to say. I guided for a few more years, but my heart was never in it again. I kept expecting to see those tracks, to hear those heavy steps in the night. I still have the notes from that trip, detailed clinical notes about stride length, track depth, hair samples, but they don't capture the feeling. They don't capture the sheer, gut-wrenching terror of knowing with absolute certainty that you are not at the top of the food chain. that there's something else out there in the old woods. Something that walks on two legs, something that watches, and something that knows you're there. I never saw it again, but I know it's there. I know what I saw, and sometimes on a cold, quiet night in October, I'll wake up and I'll just listen, and for a second I swear I can hear it. That slow, deep breathing, hoo, shh, just outside my window. Story 11. All right, I'm just gonna type this out. I've been putting it off for years, but I need to get it out there. Maybe someone else has seen what I've seen. Maybe I'm not crazy. I don't know. My name's not important, but for years I owned and ran a little bait and tackle shop right on the Kalama River in Kalama, Washington. It was my life. I loved it. The smell of the river in the morning, the sound of the fishermen coming in for coffee and a chat before heading out. It was a simple life, a good life. That all changed. I sold the business 2 years ago. I couldn't be there anymore. I don't even fish for fun now. I can't. It's all because of what happened at a spot we all called Beginner's Hole. Beginner's Hole is about 1.5 miles upstream from where my shop was. It's a wide, slow-moving part of the river, perfect for new anglers to cast without snagging on everything. It's surrounded by this dense, dark woods, the kind that feels ancient, you know, the kind where the trees are so tall they block out the sun even on a bright day. The road to get there is just a narrow gravel forest service road. It feels remote, even though you're not that far from town. The weird stuff started small. It was early fall. The air was getting that crisp bite to it. A couple, probably in their late 20s, came into the shop looking pale, really shaken. They'd been fishing at Beginner's Hole just before sunset. They were packing their gear into their sedan when it happened. They said it was completely quiet, no wind, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, this huge thump hit the driver's side window. The guy said it wasn't like a rock. It was lower, heavier, like someone had slammed a big heavy bag of sand against the glass. The whole car rocked. The window didn't break, but it was webbed with cracks from the impact. They said there was nothing there, no person, no animal, nothing, just the quiet woods and the sound of the river. The woman was crying in my shop. They were both so scared they just left all their fishing gear on the bank and drove straight to my place. I remember thinking it was probably some kids messing around, but their fear was real. It got under my skin. A few weeks later, it was my turn. It was a Tuesday afternoon around 3 o'clock. My beer distributor, a big, no-nonsense guy named Mike, who'd made this delivery 100 times, was stacking cases in my back storage room. We had the rear door propped open to get some air. The back of my shop faces the woods that lead down to the river, maybe 100 yards away. We were just shooting the breeze, talking about the mariners, when we heard it. It was a splash, not a fish jump. This was different. This was a huge, deep, violent splash, like someone had pushed a refrigerator into the river. The sound just echoed through the trees. Mike and I both stopped talking and just looked at each other. My first thought was, idiot kids, but the sound was wrong. It was too big. We walked out the back door and stood on the little gravel patch, listening. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That's the first thing that really registered. The woods are never that quiet. It was like someone had hit a mute button. Then Mike, who was standing a few feet ahead of me, just froze. His whole body went stiff. His eyes got wide, and his jaw literally dropped open. He made this little gasping sound, like all the air had been punched out of him. He started backing up, his hands coming up like he was trying to shield himself from something. "What?" I said, my voice coming out as a whisper. "Mike, what is it?" He just pointed a trembling finger towards the riverbank, down where the older trees were thick. "Oh my God," he choked out. It's a giant ape." I followed his gaze. I didn't see an ape. What I saw, for just a split second, was a massive, dark, hairy shape moving upright from the river's edge into the tree line. It was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing made me feel small. It was just a glimpse, a shadow of something impossibly big and fast, crashing through the undergrowth. It was gone before my brain could even process what my eyes were seeing. Mike was panicking. He was a big guy, ex-military, and I'd never seen him scared of anything, but he was terrified. Pure, white-faced terror. We gotta go inside now," he was babbling, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the door. We stumbled back into the storage room, slamming the door shut and throwing the deadbolt. We were both breathing hard, just staring at each other. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. We stood there in the dim light, not saying a word, just listening. For a minute there was nothing, just the hum of the drink cooler in the front of the shop. Then it started. It was a low sound at first, so low it was more a vibration in my chest than a noise in my ears. A deep guttural moan. It came from the woods right behind the shop. It didn't sound like a bear. I've heard bears. This was different, deeper, more intelligent. It was a sound of pure power. Then the moan rose in pitch. It climbed and climbed, turning into this high, piercing scream that felt like it was drilling right into my skull. It was an unholy sound. It was full of rage and hate and something else I can't describe. It was a promise that we were not safe. That sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour. It felt like the world had stopped. When it finally cut off, the silence that followed was even heavier, even more terrifying. Mike looked at me, his eyes still wide. "I'm not going back there," he whispered. "I'm not ever getting out of my truck back here again." He finished stacking the beer in record time and practically ran to his truck. He didn't even say goodbye. I locked up the shop early that day. I sat in my apartment above the store with all the lights on, just listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. That should have been the end of it for me. I should have listened to my own fear. But a man's got to make a living, right? And a part of me, a stupid, stubborn part, was trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, a weird, giant bipedal bear that screams, yeah. So a month later, I agreed to a guided trip. 2 clients, a father and son from Portland. They were beginners, so I took them to Beginner's Hole. It was a mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life. It was one of those perfect, crisp October mornings. The sun was out, but the air was cold. The river was like glass with a low mist hanging over it. It was beautiful. It felt safe. I had almost convinced myself that the thing with Mike was a one-off, a bizarre fluke. We were wading out into the hole, about waist deep. The water was freezing, biting through my waders. I was showing them how to cast, the basic overhead cast. I was using a heavier rod, one I kept for bigger fish like steelhead. I made a cast, letting the lure, a big flashy spinner, settle in the current. That's when I felt the tug. It wasn't the sharp, fighting pull of a fish. It was different. It was heavy, solid, like I'd snagged a sunken log. I sighed. "Ah, snagged on the bottom," I said to the father, starting to reel in, putting some pressure on the line to try and pop it free. But the log moved. It wasn't a frantic fight. It was a slow, powerful, deliberate pull. The rod bent double, the line singing as it cut through the water. My reel started screaming as line peeled off. This wasn't a fish. This was too strong, too purposeful. "What is it?" the kid asked, his voice excited. I don't know," I muttered, my knuckles white on the rod. I was putting all my weight into it, digging my boots into the riverbed, but I was being dragged forward step by step. The thing on the other end was just toying with me. The father was looking worried now. He could see the strain on my face. Then, upstream from us, the water erupted. It didn't just splash, it bulged. The surface of the river just rose up, and it kept rising. A shape emerged from the water. It was huge, covered in wet, dark hair that was plastered to its body. It was standing waist deep in the river, its back to us at first. It was massive. The shoulders were impossibly wide, like a NFL linebacker times 3. The arms were long, thick, and powerful. It was the thing I'd only glimpsed before. My fishing line was taut, leading straight to its lower back. I had hooked it. I had hooked this thing. It turned its upper body towards us. I didn't see its face clearly. It was a blur of dark hair and shadow. But I felt its attention. I felt a wave of pure, primal fear wash over me, so intense that my legs went weak. The cold of the river didn't matter anymore. All I could feel was this icy terror locking my joints. The creature reached back with one of those long, muscular arms. Its hand. I don't even know if it was a hand. It was big and dark, fumbling near where my lure was embedded. It made a low, rumbling sound, a growl of pure annoyance. It wasn't even in pain. It was just irritated. Then, with a simple, brutal yank of its body, it broke my line. The tension on my rod vanished so suddenly I stumbled backward, almost falling into the water. It stood there for another second, a giant hairy silhouette in the misty river, water streaming off its back. It looked real, impossibly, terrifyingly real. It wasn't a ghost or a monster from a movie. It was an animal, a living, breathing animal that wasn't supposed to exist. Then it took a step, then another, moving with a powerful, fluid grace that belied its size. It walked downstream, the water barely seeming to slow it, and within moments it was swallowed by the thick brush on the far bank. It was just gone. The three of us stood there, frozen. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the river and the frantic beating of my own heart. The father finally put his arm around his son, who was shaking. We waded back to shore in silence, our gear forgotten. We didn't run. We were too stunned, too scared to even do that. It was like we were moving through mud. We drove back to my shop without a single word. I gave them their money back. They just nodded, got in their car, and drove away. I never saw them again. I sold the business 6 months later. I couldn't be there anymore. Every creak of the old building, every noise from the woods set my teeth on edge. I kept expecting to hear that low moan turn into a scream again. I saw it. I hooked it. It was real. And I haven't been back to the Kalama River since Story 12. All right, I'll just come out and say it. I saw something out there on the edge of my property last summer. Something I can't explain, and it's been eating at me ever since. I need to get this out, to write it down somewhere, because I can't talk about it with people around here. They'd either think I'm crazy, or they'd get all excited and turn my quiet piece of land into a circus. So I'm just gonna tell you what happened, exactly how I remember it. It was a Tuesday, toward the end of August. I live alone on a decent-sized piece of land in eastern Washington. It's not a huge farm, just enough for me to manage, with a big open field that rolls down to a creek. And beyond that, it's all dense fir trees climbing up the foothills. It's quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones. That evening, the air was still warm from the day, but you could feel that little bite of coolness that says summer's almost done. The light was that long golden kind that makes everything look soft and detailed. I was out near the fence line that separates my mowed field from the wilder part of the property, just past my vegetable patch. I had my binoculars with me. I do that sometimes in the evening, just scan the deer trails that run along the creek. It's peaceful. Lets me unwind. The creek is lined with these old cottonwood trees, and their leaves were starting to get that dusty end-of-summer look. Beyond the creek, the wall of fir trees is dark, even in full daylight. It's like a solid, dark green barrier. I was leaning against a fence post, the wood rough and warm under my forearm, bringing the binoculars up to my eyes. I remember the smell of dry grass and warm earth. I was scanning the edge of the tree line, not really expecting to see much. Maybe a deer stepping out for an early drink. The binoculars are a good pair. Steiner military marine ones I got years ago. They're heavy, and they bring everything in close, crystal clear. I was sweeping them slowly from left to right, following the curve of the creek, when my view just stopped. Something was there, at the very edge of the shadows where the firs meet the open grass. It was tall, really tall, and it was just standing there perfectly still. My first thought, my brain's automatic response was, weird-looking bear. But it was upright, not hunched over like a bear on its hind legs, but standing straight up like a person, a massive, impossibly broad person. I tightened my grip on the binoculars, my knuckles going white. I held my breath, trying to keep the lenses steady. The thing was covered in hair, fur, whatever you call it. It was a dark, shaggy brown, almost black in the shadows. The sun was behind me, so it was lighting the thing up perfectly. I could see the musculature under that fur, the huge shoulders, the long arms hanging down by its sides. It had a head, but it wasn't a bear's head. It was more conical, sloping back from heavy brow ridges. I couldn't make out any eyes, just deep shadows. My heart was starting to thump against my ribs. A hard, slow rhythm. This wasn't right. This wasn't a bear. I've seen bears. This was different. It was the posture, the sheer size of it. It had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was just standing there, looking out across the open field, right toward my general direction. I felt a cold trickle of sweat run down my spine, even though the evening was cool. Then it moved. It took a step out of the tree line, and it wasn't a clumsy, shuffling step. It was a smooth, purposeful stride, a bipedal stride, 1 foot in front of the other, just like a man, but with a powerful, grounded grace that was utterly alien. The sheer size of its feet, the way they pressed into the soft earth near the creek bank, it was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. And then, a second figure emerged from the firs, right behind the first one. This one was smaller, a lot smaller, still big, maybe 5.5 feet tall, but built slimmer, and its hair was different. It wasn't that dark brown. It was a reddish brown, like cinnamon. It moved differently too, quicker, more fidgety. It stayed close to the big one's side, almost touching it. My brain, reeling, supplied the word juvenile. It looked like a kid. The awe I felt in that moment was instantly swamped by a fresh wave of pure, undiluted fear. This wasn't just one animal. This was a group. A third one came out then, another smaller one, similar in size and build to the second, with the same reddish-brown hair. It moved right up next to the other one, and the two of them seemed to stick together. They were young, I was sure of it. The way they moved, their proportions, they looked like youngsters. The big one, the dark one, took another few steps toward the creek. It didn't look back. But the two younger ones immediately followed, staying tight to its flank. They moved as a unit. My hands were shaking so bad I had to lower the binoculars for a second, take a ragged breath, and wipe my sweaty palms on my jeans. The air felt thin, like I couldn't get enough of it. My mouth was dry as dust. I raised the binoculars again, my heart hammering now, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. They were approaching the creek. The water there is shallow, maybe a foot deep, running over gravel. The big one stepped into the water without breaking stride. I saw the water splash around its lower legs, darkening the long, dark hair. It was then I got a real sense of its mass. It was heavy, immensely solid. The two younger ones followed, splashing through the water with less confidence, their movements more hurried. They were across the creek in a few seconds, coming up onto the open farmland, my farmland. They were now in full view, maybe 200 yards away from me, with nothing between us but open, grassy field. And then the fourth one appeared. It came out of the same spot in the tree line. This one was big. Not as tall as the first one, but broader, thicker through the chest and shoulders. Its fur was the same dark brown as the lead one. It paused for a second at the edge of the trees, and I swear it looked back the way they had come. It was a deliberate scanning motion. Then it turned and followed the others, moving with the same powerful ground-eating walk. It was bringing up the rear, a guardian. That's when the full, horrifying, incredible reality of what I was seeing crashed down on me. This wasn't a random animal. This was a family, A mother or a father leading two kids with another adult, maybe the other parent, watching the back. They were crossing my field, moving from one patch of forest to another, using the cover of the creek bed and the fading light. The terror moment, the one that's etched into my brain, was right then. Watching them move, so tightly grouped, so clearly aware of each other. The big one in front, the two young ones in the middle, the other big one behind. They were communicating without making a sound I could hear. A flick of a head, a slight change in pace. They were a unit, a family. I felt a mix of emotions so intense it was almost paralyzing. There was awe, yeah, the sheer, staggering privilege of seeing something so secret, so unknown, but it was dwarfed by a deep primal fear. It was the fear of being a spectator to something I was never meant to see. It was the understanding that these things were real, they were intelligent, and they were right there. If they turned and looked my way, they would see me, a lone man standing by a fence post. I felt incredibly small and exposed. They moved across the open ground with a purpose I could feel even from that distance. Their strides were long and efficient, covering ground quickly without seeming to rush. The two younger ones almost trotted to keep up, their reddish hair catching the last of the sun, making them stand out against the green grass. The lead one, the big dark one, never looked back. It just kept walking, its head swiveling slowly from side to side, scanning the terrain. The one in the rear did the same, its gaze sweeping the field behind them, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought it looked right at me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, but it just kept scanning and moved on. It hadn't seen me, or if it had, it didn't care. They were heading for another patch of woods on the far western edge of my property, a thick stand of firs and pine that climbs up a steep hillside. The distance between us was shrinking. 150 yards. 100. I could see them more clearly now, even without the binoculars. The sheer bulk of the adults, the way their fur moved with their muscles, the length of their arms, swinging slightly as they walked. I could see that the younger ones had lighter-colored skin on their faces, around their mouths and eyes. I was trembling all over, a fine, constant shake that started in my hands and ran all through my body. My legs felt weak. I thought I was going to be sick. I wanted to run, to get back to my house, to lock the door, but I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Only this was beautiful and terrifying all at once. They reached the edge of the far tree line. The lead one didn't even break stride. It just walked straight into the shadows between the trees and was gone. The two younger ones followed, one right after the other, disappearing into the darkness. The fourth one, the one bringing up the rear, paused one last time at the edge of the woods. It stood there for a full 5 seconds, a massive, dark silhouette against the deep green of the firs. It turned its head, and again I felt its gaze sweep across the field, over the creek, past the cottonwoods, and for a second time, right over me. This time, it felt different. It felt like an acknowledgement, a final look to make sure the path was clear. Then it turned, and in one smooth motion, stepped into the trees and vanished. Just like that, they were gone. The field was empty. The only sound was the faint gurgle of the creek and the blood pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 2 minutes from the time the first one stepped out until the last one disappeared. 2 minutes that rewired my entire understanding of the world. I finally lowered the binoculars, my arms aching from being held so rigid. My whole body was trembling. I looked down at my hands, and they were shaking so bad I could barely hold the binoculars. I had to sit down, right there in the dry grass, because my legs wouldn't support me anymore. I just sat, staring at the empty spot where they'd vanished, trying to process what I'd just seen. The light was fading fast now, the gold turning to deep blue. The woods where they'd disappeared were just a black wall. I kept expecting to see something, a movement, a sign, but there was nothing. It was as if they'd never been there at all. But they had. I saw them. A family group of something that shouldn't exist, moving through my field like they owned the place, which in that moment I guess they did. I felt a profound sense of violation, but not by them. By the knowledge that the world is so much bigger and stranger and more unknown than I ever let myself believe. The map of my reality had just been redrawn, and there were whole continents on it that I never knew were there. I sat there until full dark, until the mosquitoes found me and the stars came out. I finally got up, my joints stiff, and walked back to my house on unsteady legs. I locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the window looking out at the dark field, jumping at every little sound. That was last summer. I still live here. I still go out in the evening sometimes, but I never look at the tree line the same way. I know what's in there now, or at least I know a little piece of it, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can smell something on the air, a musky, earthy smell that wasn't there before, and I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that I wasn't just a spectator that day. I was being watched too, and part of me wonders if they're still out there watching, waiting for the right moment to cross again. Story 13. This was back in early October a few years ago. I'd taken a week off work for a solo mule deer hunt. I'd been scouting this particular area in Ferry County, Washington for a couple seasons. It's rugged high country, the kind of place where you feel both incredibly small and completely free at the same time. The Sherman Creek drainage is this vast, deep cut in the earth, all thick evergreens and rocky outcrops. It's beautiful, but it's also lonely, properly lonely. I'd packed in the day before, setting up a small camp mid-mountain. It wasn't much, just a one-man tent, a lightweight sleeping bag, and a small stove. I liked the simplicity of it. That day, I'd spent the morning and early afternoon still hunting, moving slow and quiet, but I hadn't seen much, just some old sign. As evening started to come on, I decided to call it a day and head back to camp. The light was getting that long, golden quality, casting deep shadows through the trees. You know how it is in the mountains. When the sun starts to dip, the temperature drops fast. I remember feeling that first real chill of the evening and pulling my jacket a bit tighter. Back at camp, I got a small fire going. Not a big one, just enough to boil some water for coffee and a dehydrated meal. The routine is comforting. The hiss of the stove, the smell of pine smoke, the absolute quiet. That's what gets me out there, the quiet, or what's supposed to be quiet. I was just sitting on a log, sipping my coffee, watching the last of the light fade from the sky above the canyon. The stars were starting to come out, little pinpricks in the deep blue. It was peaceful. I was tired from the day. My muscles ached in that good, honest way they do after a long hike, and I was just starting to relax, to let my mind wander. And then I heard it. It came from far below, way down in the bottom of the Sherman Creek drainage. The sound traveled up the steep slopes, clear as a bell in the thin, cold air. It was a howl, but like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It wasn't a coyote. I've heard plenty of coyotes. Their yips and howls are high-pitched, almost frantic. This was different. It started low, a deep, resonant pitch that seemed to vibrate right through the ground and up into the soles of my boots. It was a guttural, chesty sound, the kind of noise you feel more than you hear. Then it rose, smoothly, not like a siren, but like something alive and massive was forcing the sound up from its lungs. It climbed to a medium pitch, a long, drawn-out wail that held for what felt like an eternity. And then it tapered off, fading slowly back into silence. The whole thing lasted close to 10 seconds. I was frozen solid on that log. My coffee mug was halfway to my lips, and I just stopped. Every single hair on my body stood straight up, my arms, my neck, the back of my legs. It was an immediate primal reaction. A cold flush went over me, followed by a heat that made me feel dizzy. My heart wasn't just beating fast, it was slamming against my ribs like it was trying to get out. The silence that followed was heavier than any silence I'd ever experienced. It was thick, pressing in on my eardrums. I didn't move a muscle. I just listened, straining to hear anything else. The forest had gone completely dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, no rustle of small animals. Nothing. It was as if every living thing for miles around had heard that sound and was holding its breath, just like I was. And then it came again. The exact same sequence, that low, bone-shaking rumble that built into a sustained, mournful howl, holding for those long seconds before dying away. It was identical. The same duration, the same pitch, the same terrifying quality. It wasn't a random animal cry. It was a call, a deliberate, controlled vocalization. It repeated the call one more time, a third, perfect replication of the first two. Then, true silence returned. For a minute, maybe two, I just sat there. My mind was racing, trying to put a name to what I'd heard. Bear, no wolf. I've heard wolves in Montana, and this was different. Deeper, more powerful, more intelligent. That's the word that flashed into my head and stuck there. It sounded intelligent. There was a purpose behind it that a regular animal noise doesn't have. I finally put my coffee mug down on the ground, my hand shaking so badly the metal clattered against a rock. I stood up, my legs feeling weak and watery. My first instinct was to get to my rifle. It was leaned up against a tree near my tent. I walked over, my footsteps sounding incredibly loud in the quiet, and I picked it up. The familiar weight of the wood and steel in my hands was a small comfort, but only a small one. Whatever made that sound, I didn't know if a .30-06 would even matter. I stood there by the dying fire, scanning the tree line around my camp. The darkness between the trees was absolute. My little circle of firelight suddenly felt tiny and pathetic, a fragile island in a vast black ocean. I remember the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a vague paranoia. It was a physical sensation, a pressure on the back of my neck, like there were eyes out there in the dark, huge eyes just fixed on me. I decided right then I wasn't sleeping. Not a chance. I kicked dirt over the fire, smothering it completely. The last ember dying felt like a defeat, but I didn't want the light giving away my position. I sat down with my back against a thick pine tree, my rifle across my lap, and I listened. Every little sound was a new terror. A branch cracked somewhere off to my left, and I jerked the rifle toward it, my finger sliding to the trigger guard. It was probably just a branch falling, a normal forest sound, but to me, it was a footstep. The wind picked up a little, sighing through the tops of the pines, and it sounded like whispering. I'd hear the scuttle of what was surely just a mouse or a squirrel in the dry leaves, and my brain would instantly translate it into something huge and heavy, creeping closer. My body was wound so tight it hurt, my shoulders were up around my ears, my jaw was clenched. I had to consciously remind myself to breathe. The cold seeped through my clothes, but I was sweating, a cold, clammy sweat that made me shiver. Time stopped having any meaning. I'd look at my watch, and only 2 minutes would have passed. It felt like hours. I was trapped in this cycle of listening, hearing something, panicking, and then trying to convince myself it was nothing. I kept replaying the sound in my head, that low to high howl. It was burned into my memory. I can still hear it now, clear as day if I close my eyes. It wasn't just scary, it was wrong. It was something that shouldn't exist, something that didn't belong in the world I understood. At some point, the sky began to lighten, from black to deep blue, then to gray. The relief I felt when I could finally see the shapes of the trees around me was overwhelming. My whole body ached from sitting rigidly all night. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. I stood up, my joints popping, and looked around. The forest looked normal again in the weak morning light. Just trees and rocks. I packed up my camp in a hurry. I didn't care about hunting anymore. The only thing I cared about was getting off that mountain. I stuffed my tent into its sack, not even bothering to roll it properly. I crammed everything into my pack, shouldered it, and picked up my rifle. I didn't even make coffee. I just started walking, following my GPS back toward the truck. The hike out was just as bad. Every shadow was a threat. Every time I had to push through a thicket, my heart would be in my throat. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something massive and dark moving between the trees behind me. I've never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in my life. I was just a man walking through the woods, and I knew that I was not at the top of the food chain out there. I made it to my truck by mid-morning. When I saw it, that beat-up old Ford sitting in the trailhead parking area, I almost cried. I threw my gear in the back, got in and locked the doors. I just sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, letting the reality of being in a metal box sink in. I started the engine and drove, and I didn't stop until I was well out of the mountains and back on the main highway. I got home later that day. My wife asked how the hunt went, and I just said, "Slow, didn't see much." I couldn't tell her. How do you even start that conversation? "Hey, honey, I think I heard a monster in the woods." She would have been worried, sure, but she also would have thought I was losing it, so I kept it to myself. I took a long, hot shower, trying to wash the feeling of dread off me, but it was stuck. For years, I didn't tell a soul. The memory of that sound and the terror of that night became this secret burden I carried around. I'd be at work or mowing the lawn, and it would just pop into my head, and that cold feeling would wash over me again. I stopped going on solo hunts. I'd make excuses or only go with a large group. I couldn't handle the thought of being that alone in the wilderness again. Then, a couple of years ago, my father-in-law and I were at his place, cleaning our shotguns before pheasant season. We'd had a few beers, and we were just talking the way you do. The subject of weird things in the woods came up. Hunters' tales, that kind of thing. I don't know what came over me, but I just started talking. I told him the whole thing. About the camp, the fading light, the 3 howls, the all-night vigil, the sheer pants-wetting terror of it. I told him I'd never heard anything like it, and that I knew in my gut it wasn't a bear or a wolf. He listened quietly, not interrupting, just nodding slowly. When I finished, he put down the cleaning rod he was using and looked at me. He didn't laugh. He didn't look skeptical. He just looked serious. He said, "I believe you." Then he told me his story. He was trapping beaver up in the Okanagan Highlands back in the late 70s. He was checking his line at first light, and he came across a set of tracks in the mud by a creek. They were huge, he said, bigger than a grizzly's, but shaped like a man's foot, just enormous, and the stride between them was longer than any man could take. He followed them for a little ways until they just disappeared into the rocky ground. He said he packed up his traps and got out of there that same morning, and he never went back to that particular creek. We just sat there in his garage for a while, not saying much. He believed me. That was the thing. He didn't think I was crazy. He'd seen something that pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Hearing his story didn't make me feel better. Not really. If anything, it deepened the fear, because it confirmed that I wasn't the only one. That there was something out there, in those vast, lonely stretches of wilderness, something old and powerful and unknown. The terror of that unearthly vocalization marked the beginning for me. The years of silence were the middle, and my father-in-law's story. That was the end of me being able to pretend it was just my imagination. I still don't know what it was. I don't have a name for it. I just know what I heard, and the pure, undiluted fear that it planted deep inside me. It's still there. And every time I look out at a dark line of trees on a distant mountain, I remember that sound. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that we are not alone out there. We just don't know what else is sharing the woods with us. Story 14. Okay, So this happened back in July of '93. I was working as a wildland firefighter for the Forest Service out of Skycomish, Washington, mostly in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. It was just another day on the job, or at least it started that way. Me and my partner, we'd been teamed up for a couple seasons by then, were assigned to check out some lightning strikes in the Beckler River drainage. Lightning hits are pretty common after storms, and most of the time, it's nothing. Maybe a smoldering tree or some scorched ground, but you gotta check everyone. That's the drill. The morning of July 23rd was overcast, with that damp, cool feel you get in the mountains even in summer. The air had that fresh, rain-washed smell, mixed with the usual pine and damp earth. We drove out in one of the service trucks, bouncing along the gravel roads until we reached the trailhead. From there, it was all on foot. We geared up, packs with water, tools, radios, and started hiking in. The Beckler area is steep, thick with old-growth fir and hemlock, and the underbrush is a mess of ferns and devil's club that'll tear your skin up if you're not careful. My partner was a solid guy, experienced, didn't say much unless he had to, which was fine by me. We moved at a steady pace, scanning the ridges and slopes for any sign of smoke. It took us a couple hours to reach the first strike zone. The GPS coordinates led us to a spot on a nasty, steep slope, maybe 60 or 70 degrees, covered in loose shale and deadfall. Sure enough, there was a small fire smoldering at the base of a big cedar. Nothing major, but it had to be contained. We got to work, digging a line around it with our shovels and Pulaskis. The ground was slippery from recent rain, and the air was getting warmer as the day went on, making sweat stick my shirt to my back. We worked quietly, the only sounds our breathing and the scrape of tools on dirt. It felt routine, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times. After we had the fire contained, it was just a patch about the size of a car hood. We were packing up our gear. My partner was standing on a loose bit of slope, and his foot slid out from under him. He didn't fall hard, but his shovel went flying, clattering down the hill and disappearing into a thicket of salmonberry bushes. He cursed under his breath, and I said, I'd go get it. No big deal, right? I started picking my way down, careful not to lose my own footing. The brush was dense, and I had to push through branches that snagged on my clothes. That's when I caught the smell. At first, I thought it was just decay, maybe a dead animal or something, but this was different. It hit me like a physical blow, this overpowering stench of rot and musk, like a mix of wet dog, garbage, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach churn. I paused, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I saw it. A kind of opening in the hillside, partially hidden by ferns and fallen logs. It wasn't a proper cave, more like a crevice or a hollow, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, dark inside and radiating that foul odor. I hesitated for a second, but I needed to get the shovel. It was lying right near the entrance, so I stepped closer, my boots crunching on twigs. The smell got worse, so bad I almost gagged. I bent down to grab the shovel, and that's when I heard it, a rustling in the brush above me, up the slope. Not like a deer or a bird, this was heavier, more deliberate. I straightened up slowly, my heart starting to pound. I scanned the trees, but I didn't see anything at first. Then, out of nowhere, a rock the size of a bowling ball came flying past my head. I mean, it whistled right by my ear, close enough that I felt the air move. It smashed into a tree trunk behind me with a loud thud. I froze, adrenaline surging through me. What the hell was that? Before I could process it, another rock flew, this one hitting the ground near my feet and sending dirt and pebbles flying. My instincts kicked in, and I dropped into a crouch, trying to make myself small. I could hear more movement now, something big moving through the trees above me. It wasn't running. It was more like a steady, heavy crashing, like branches being pushed aside with force. I peered up, squinting through the foliage, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and dark, moving upright through the trees. It was maybe 50 yards away, but even from that distance I could tell it was huge. I'd guess 7 to 9 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark, matted hair. It didn't move like a bear. Bears are bulky and tend to amble, but this thing was striding, almost human-like, but bigger and more powerful. It was weaving between the firs, and for a few seconds I just stared, my brain trying to make sense of it. Fear clamped down on my chest, cold and tight. I couldn't breathe properly. Then I yelled, I don't even remember what I said. Something like, "Hey, there's something up here, Bigfoot maybe." My voice came out shaky and too loud. As soon as I shouted, the movement stopped. The figure vanished, just melted into the trees like it was never there. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like the whole forest had gone dead. I stayed crouched, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The only thing left was that awful smell still hanging in the air, and the memory of those rocks flying at me. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, I scrambled back up the slope to where my partner was. He'd heard me yell and was looking pale, asking what was going on. I told him what I saw, my words tumbling out fast. We didn't stick around to investigate. We grabbed our gear and hightailed it out of there, moving as fast as we could without falling. The whole way down I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing again, but the forest stayed quiet. When we got back to the truck, we radioed in the incident, but what could we really say? We reported the rock throwing and the sighting, but it was never followed up on, not in any way that mattered. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but that stench and the sight of that figure are burned into my memory, like I stumbled into someone else's territory and got warned off. Story 15. Okay, I'm just going to type this out. I don't know if anyone will believe me, and honestly, I don't even care anymore. I just need to get it out there, to put it into words, because it's been eating at me for years now. My name's not important, but I'm 55 years old. I live in Alabama, and I've been a sober, clear-headed man my whole life. I don't do drugs, I don't drink, and I've never had any kind of mental episode. What I saw one afternoon just a few years back, I still can't explain, I can't rationalize it, and I sure as hell can't forget it. It was a Tuesday, I remember that much, middle of October. The heat of the summer had finally broken, and there was that nice, cool crispness in the air that makes you want to be outside. I'd spent the morning doing chores around the house, and I decided to take a drive down this old logging road that cuts through a big stretch of woods not far from my place. It's a road I've driven 1,000 times. I know every pothole, every dip, every bend where the trees get so thick they block out the sun. I was in my pickup truck, an old Ford that's seen better days, but it gets me where I need to go. I was just puttering along, maybe doing 15, 20 miles an hour, not in any hurry. The windows were down, and I could smell that damp, earthy smell of the woods after a dry spell, a little like wet leaves and pine. The radio was on, some old country station playing softly in the background. I was just content, thinking about what I might get my grandkids for Christmas, things like that. Normal stuff. The road ahead curved to the left, and as I came around the bend, my headlights, I had them on even though it was daytime, just out of habit, swept across the asphalt. And that's when I saw it. It came out of the woods on the right-hand side. It didn't burst out, it just emerged, and it started crossing the road, right in front of me. My first thought, the one that lasted for half a second, was that it was a person, maybe a hunter in some kind of weird ghillie suit, but that thought evaporated instantly. This was no person. I'm a big guy. I stand 6 feet 4 inches tall. I've played football. I've done manual labor my whole life. I know what big looks like. This thing was bigger than me. I'd guess it was 6 feet 8. Easy, maybe even taller, but it was kind of hunched over. It was covered in hair. Not fur, like a bear, but long, shaggy hair. It was a dark, dirty brown color, like wet bark, and it hung off its body. I could see it clearly. That hair had to be 4, 5, maybe 6 inches long in places. It was matted and stringy, but it was the way it moved that it stopped my heart. It didn't walk like a man. Its shoulders were slumped way forward, and its arms, God, its arms were so long, unnaturally long. Its hands hung down past its knees, just swinging as it moved, and it wasn't running. It wasn't walking. It was this glide, a fast, powerful shuffle. Its legs moved, but it was almost like it was sliding across the ground. The closest thing I can compare it to is how you see an orangutan move in those nature documentaries, that knuckle-walking sort of motion. But this was upright, and it was smoother, much, much smoother and faster. It covered the width of that 2-lane road in maybe 2 or 3 of those shuffling steps. Time didn't slow down. It felt like it sped up. My brain was trying to catch up, to process this impossible thing that was happening 30 feet in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed on the dry asphalt, and the truck shuddered to a stop. The seatbelt locked up and dug into my shoulder. The creature was directly in front of me now, in the middle of my lane. It was maybe 20 feet away. The headlights were right on it. It turned its head and looked at me. I didn't see glowing red eyes or anything like that. I saw eyes. Dark, deep-set eyes under a heavy, sloping brow. There was an intelligence there. It wasn't the blank stare of a deer or the simple curiosity of a dog. It was a look of assessment. It looked right at me, right through the windshield, and it knew I was there. It knew what I was. Its face wasn't flat like a man's. It was pushed forward more like an ape, but not quite. The mouth was wide, and the whole thing was just wrong. It was a face that shouldn't exist. The smell hit me then. I'd had the windows down, remember? It rolled into the cab of the truck, this wave of stink. It was a thick, heavy odor, like a combination of a wet dog, rotten meat, and just filth. An overwhelming, musky animal stench that made my stomach clench. It was the smell of something that lived deep in the woods and never cleaned itself. It was primal. It was a smell that screamed predator. Our eyes were locked for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 seconds. In that moment, every single ounce of blood in my body felt like it turned to ice water. My heart wasn't just pounding, it was slamming against my ribs, a frantic, panicked hammering that I could feel in my throat and my ears. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was pure, undiluted terror, the kind of fear you read about, the kind that's supposed to be prehistoric, a leftover from when we were prey. That's what this was. I was prey, looking at a predator. Then it moved again. It finished its glide across the road. It didn't break into a run. It just moved with that same unsettling, effortless speed. It reached the other side of the road, where the ditch and the tree line were. It didn't crash through the undergrowth. It just melted into it. 1 second it was there, this massive, hulking shape at the edge of the woods, and the next it was gone. The leaves rustled for a second, and then there was nothing. Just the quiet woods. The whole thing, from the moment I first saw it to the moment it vanished, lasted maybe 7 or 8 seconds. I sat there. I don't know how long. The truck was still running. The radio was still playing some cheerful song that felt like it was from another universe. The smell was still in the air, clinging to everything. I was shaking. Not just a little tremble, but full-body shakes, like I was freezing cold. My teeth were chattering. I had to clench my jaw to make them stop. I looked at the empty road. I looked at the spot where it had been. My mind was just a scrambled mess of static and panic. What was that? What the hell was that? I finally managed to put the truck in park because my foot was still jammed on the brake pedal. I took a few deep breaths, but the air was still tainted with that smell. I rolled up my window, my hand trembling so badly it was hard to crank the handle. I just sat there, in the middle of that empty logging road, and tried to get a grip. A bear? No. No way! Bears don't walk like that. They don't have arms that long. They don't have that posture. A man in a suit? Absolutely not. I've been to Halloween stores. I've seen cheap costumes and expensive movie props. Nothing moves like that. Nothing has that presence. That thing had weight. It had mass. It displaced the air around it. It was solid and it was real. I'm a practical man. I fix things. I understand how engines work, how wood grain runs, why plants grow where they do. I believe in what I can see and touch. And I had just seen and smelled something that defied every single bit of that. After maybe 5 minutes, the shaking subsided to a dull tremor in my hands. I put the truck in drive and crept forward. I stopped right where the thing had been. I looked out my window, down into the ditch and the wall of trees. Nothing. No sound. No movement. It was like the woods themselves had swallowed it whole and gone back to sleep. I drove home. The whole way, my eyes were darting to the tree line on either side of the road. Every shadow looked like a hunched figure. Every clump of bushes seemed like it could hide something. The comfort I'd always felt in these woods was gone, replaced by a deep, crawling paranoia. I pulled into my driveway and just sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, trying to compose myself before I went inside. I didn't want to scare my wife. How do you tell someone you just saw a monster? A real one. I walked in, and she was in the kitchen. She took one look at me and asked if I was okay. She said I was pale as a ghost. I just mumbled something about not feeling well, that I had a headache, and I went and lay down in the bedroom. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, replaying those 7 seconds over and over and over again. The shambling glide, the long swinging arms, the dark eyes that looked right into me, the smell. I never reported it to anyone. Who would I call? The police? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. A wildlife officer. They'd say it was a bear and hang up. I told my wife a few days later, after I'd had time to process it a little. I gave her the short version. She didn't laugh, God bless her. She just listened and held my hand and said, "This is a big, strange world." But I could see the doubt in her eyes. The kind of doubt I would have had before. I've never gone back down that particular logging road. I'll take the long way around now. Sometimes at night, if I'm outside taking the trash out, I'll hear something in the woods behind my house. A branch snap, an owl hoot, and I'll freeze. I'll stand there in the dark, listening, my heart starting that same frantic rhythm, and I'll stare into the blackness between the trees. I saw something that day, something that shouldn't be. I'm a 55-year-old man who's never believed in ghosts or aliens or fairy tales. I still don't, not really, but I believe in what I saw with my own 2 eyes. I'm 6'4", and I looked up at it. It was real. It was there, and the worst part, the thing that keeps me up sometimes, isn't just the memory of it. It's the knowing that it's still out there right now, in those woods, and it knows that I saw it too. Story 16. I wasn't really paying attention to the game. My mind was wandering, thinking about work the next week or whatever, when a commercial break came on. You know how those breaks are, loud and obnoxious, trying to sell you something you don't need. I figured it was a good time to grab a beer from the kitchen. I pushed myself up out of the chair, my joints cracking a little from sitting too long, and started heading toward the kitchen, which is just off the living room, separated by a short hallway. That's when I first noticed the smell. At first it was faint, like something off in the distance, and I thought maybe it was just the usual forest odors or maybe a skunk had sprayed somewhere nearby. But as I walked toward the kitchen, it got stronger fast. It wasn't just skunk, it was worse, like rotten eggs mixed with wet dog, the kind of smell that makes your stomach turn. I remember wrinkling my nose and thinking, what the hell is that? Because it was so out of place. My house is usually pretty clean, and I don't have pets, so it couldn't be anything inside. By the time I reached the kitchen, the smell was so intense I could taste it in the back of my throat, like a metallic sour flavor that made me want to gag. I paused for a second, my hand on the fridge door, and glanced around, half expecting to see something spilled or rotten. But everything looked normal. The counters were clear, the sink was empty. I shook it off and opened the fridge, grabbing a cold beer from the shelf. The can was cool in my hand, and I popped the tab, taking a quick sip just to wash that taste out of my mouth. As I turned around to head back to the living room, my eyes drifted toward the screen door, and that's when everything froze. I mean, my whole body just locked up. There, no more than 6 feet away from me, standing on the porch just beyond the screen, was this massive figure. It was towering, way over 7 feet tall, I'd guess, and covered in dark, shaggy hair that looked matted and dirty. The light from my living room was casting a glow on it, and I could see its face clearly. A flat nose, a big, heavy brow, and eyes that glowed this eerie red color, like embers in a fire. But the worst part was that it was just standing there, completely still, watching me. Its arms were long, and I could see its fingers, thick, rough-skinned things, hanging near the screen door frame, which was pushed in slightly, like it had been leaning on it. The smell hit me full force then, so strong I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out. It was that same rotten egg and wet dog stench, but amplified, coming from this thing. My heart started hammering in my chest, so loud I could hear it in my ears, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't even think straight. I just stood there, beer can in hand, staring back at it. Time seemed to slow down, and all I could focus on were those red eyes, fixed on me, unblinking. I remember my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it a bear? No, bears don't stand like that, and they don't have eyes like that. This was something else, something I'd only heard stories about but never believed. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen in place, it just watching, but it felt like forever. Then, without thinking, I took a step back, and the old floorboard under my foot creaked. A loud, sharp sound in the silence. The moment it happened, the creature flinched, pulling away from the screen door slightly. Its fingers retracted, and it turned its head like it was listening to something. Then, in one smooth motion, it turned and walked off the porch, disappearing into the darkness beyond. But here's the thing. It didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing. It just vanished, and the only evidence it was ever there was the lingering smell, and the memory burned into my brain. As soon as it was gone, my body unlocked, and I stumbled forward, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the beer. I rushed to the screen door and slammed it shut, fumbling with the lock until it clicked into place. Then I backed away, my heart still pounding, and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The smell was still there, faint but persistent, and I felt sick to my stomach. I remember looking around the room, half expecting to see it again, but everything was quiet, too quiet. The TV was still on, the commercial break over and the game back, but I couldn't hear it over the blood rushing in my ears. I spent the next few minutes just standing there, trembling, before I forced myself to move. I went around the house, checking all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. My hands were sweaty, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, paranoid that it was still out there, watching. I ended up turning off all the lights, except for a small lamp in the corner, and I sat on the floor, away from the windows, with my back against the wall. I didn't dare go back to the recliner or anywhere near that screen door. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and silence. Every little noise, the house settling, the wind outside, made me jump. I couldn't focus on the game anymore. All I could think about was that thing and how close it had been to me, how it had just stood there, staring. I must have sat there for hours, until the game ended and the TV switched to some late-night show. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just stayed in that spot, listening, waiting for something to happen. The smell eventually faded, but the memory didn't. When the sun finally came up, I felt exhausted, drained, like I'd been through some kind of battle. I forced myself to get up and peek outside through the blinds. Everything looked normal. The porch was empty, the grass was wet with dew, but when I worked up the courage to step outside later that morning, I saw it. a patch of flattened grass near the porch, and what looked like a partial footprint, big and wide, pressed into the mud. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it was definitely there, and it sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. I never found out what it was, not for sure. People around here talk about skunk apes or Bigfoot sightings, but I always brushed them off as tall tales. Now I'm not so sure. All I know is that on that Saturday night in early September, something was on my porch, something big and smelly and terrifying, and it looked right at me. I still get shaky thinking about it, and I never leave my doors open after dark anymore. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I'll catch a whiff of something foul, and my heart will skip a beat. But it's probably just my imagination, or maybe it's not. I guess I'll never know, and that's the part that haunts me the most. Audrey, story 17. Okay, so this is something I've never really shared with anyone except my friend Eric. And even then, we don't talk about it much because it sounds crazy. But it happened, and I need to get it out there. This was back in October of 2006. I remember the date because it was around my birthday, and Eric and I decided to go small game hunting in the San Juan Mountains near Pagosa Springs, Colorado. We were both in our late 20s at the time, just a couple of guys who liked getting out into the woods to clear our heads and maybe bag a rabbit or two. That morning, we woke up early, like before sunrise early. The air had that sharp, cold bite to it that you only get in the mountains in fall. I could see my breath in the dim light inside the cabin we were staying in. We'd rented it for the weekend, nothing fancy, just a place to crash. Eric was already up making coffee on a little camp stove, and the smell filled the small room. We didn't say much. We were both tired but excited to get out there. We packed our .22 rifles, nothing too powerful, just enough for small game, and threw some sandwiches, water and extra ammo into our backpacks. I remember pulling on my heavy boots and a jacket, feeling the stiff material against my skin. The sky was starting to lighten up as we headed out, with streaks of orange and pink breaking through the dark. The drive to our hunting spot was quiet. Eric had this old pickup truck that rattled on the dirt roads, and we bounced along with the radio, playing some classic rock stations softly in the background. I was staring out the window, watching the trees go by, mostly pines and aspens, their leaves turning yellow and gold. It was beautiful, but in a lonely kind of way. We parked off a narrow Forest Service road that we'd used before, a place where not many people went. As we got out, the cold hit me again, and I zipped my jacket up higher. The ground was covered in a layer of pine needles and fallen leaves, and they crunched under our boots with every step. The sound was loud in the stillness, and it made me feel like we were the only people for miles. We started hiking in, following a trail we knew led to a good area for game. The sun was fully up by then, casting long shadows through the trees. The light filtered down in patches, making everything look kind of hazy and soft. I could smell the pine sap and the damp earth, and every now and then a breeze would rustle the leaves overhead. We walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more, not seeing much. A few squirrels chattered at us from the branches, and once a rabbit darted across the path, but it was too quick for us to take a shot. We were both getting a little frustrated, but it was still nice to be out there. Eric was ahead of me, his breath puffing out in little clouds, and I could hear the crunch of his footsteps mingling with mine. Eventually, we came to this shallow stream we'd visited before. It was one of those spots where the water was clear and cold, babbling over rocks and roots. We decided to take a break there, refill our canteens, and maybe eat one of our sandwiches. I knelt down by the water, my knees pressing into the damp ground, and dipped my hands in. The cold was shocking, almost numbing, but it felt good after the hike. I was cupping my hands to drink when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a bird or maybe a squirrel jumping between trees, but then I looked closer, and my heart kind of stuttered. There was a pine tree about 20 feet away, its branches thick and low to the ground. Something was moving in there, something small and quick. I froze, my hand still in the water, and watched as it dropped to the ground. It landed softly, almost silently, and crouched there on all fours. I could see it clearly now. It was about 3 to 4 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that looked matted and dirty. Its shape was human-like, with arms and legs, but it was smaller and more compact, like a child. Its head was round, and I could make out dark eyes that seemed to be fixed on us. It didn't move, just stayed crouched, and I felt this cold dread wash over me. My mouth went dry, and I slowly pulled my hands out of the water, not making a sound. I nudged Eric, who was still drinking from the stream. He looked up, and I saw his eyes widen. He didn't say anything, just stared. We both did. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, hard and fast, like it was trying to escape. My fingers were trembling, and I had to grip my rifle tighter to steady them. The creature didn't seem aggressive, but there was something about it that felt wrong, unnatural. It was too still, too focused on us. Then, from behind the trees, something else emerged. This one was bigger, much bigger. It stepped out slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This thing was over 7 feet tall, with dark, almost black hair that covered its entire body. It moved with a kind of grace that was terrifying, smooth and silent, like it belonged there. Its eyes were amber, and they glinted in the light, seeming to glow with an intensity that made my stomach twist. It stood there, massive and imposing, just watching us. I could see the muscles in its arms and legs, the way its chest rose and fell with each breath. It was real, solid, and I knew in that moment that we were in way over our heads. I don't know how long we stood there, maybe only seconds, but it felt like forever. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot? No, that couldn't be real. But there it was. Eric was beside me, and I heard him let out a shaky breath. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The small creature made a sound then, a chirping noise that was high-pitched, but had a weird, almost human quality to it. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It scrambled toward the big one, moving quickly, and in one fluid motion, it climbed onto its shoulder. The big one didn't flinch. It just rumbled, a low, deep sound that vibrated through the air and into my bones. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful, like the growl of a large predator, but more resonant. I could feel it in my chest, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the big one turned away from us. It didn't run or hurry. It just pushed through the brush like it was nothing, parting the branches with ease. The small one clung to its shoulder, and they disappeared into the trees within seconds. The forest seemed to swallow them up, and suddenly it was quiet again, except for the sound of the stream and our ragged breathing. Eric and I were left standing there, stunned. I couldn't move at first. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to lean against a tree to steady myself. My heart was still hammering, and I was sweating despite the cold. I looked at Eric, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight. "Now." We started backing away from the stream, keeping our eyes on the spot where they'd vanished. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and I kept expecting to see those amber eyes again. As we turned to head back the way we came, we heard rustling in the bushes around us. It wasn't just in one direction. It was all around, like something was moving with us, keeping pace. The sounds would get closer, then fade, but they never stopped. It felt like we were being watched, hunted, almost. My skin crawled, and I had this overwhelming urge to run, but I forced myself to walk slowly, not wanting to attract attention. We picked up our pace, almost jogging now. The trail seemed longer than on the way in, and every shadow looked like it could be something hiding. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my neck stiff with tension. Eric was ahead of me, and I could see him doing the same thing. His knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. The rustling continued, sometimes to our left, sometimes to our right, and once, I swear I heard a low grunt from behind us. It made me freeze for a second, but Eric grabbed my arm and pulled me along. "Don't stop," he muttered. After what felt like an eternity, we came to a muddy patch near where the stream curved. I was looking down, trying to watch my step, when I saw it. A large, partial footprint in the mud. It was massive, at least 18 inches long, with what looked like toes. The print was deep, like whatever made it was heavy, and the shape was more human-like than any animal I'd seen. It wasn't a bear track. I've seen plenty of those, and this was different. The toes were distinct, and the arch was pronounced. I pointed it out to Eric, and we both stopped to look. He knelt down, careful not to touch it, and just shook his head. "That's not from any bear," he said quietly. That was the moment it really hit me. We had seen a baby and an adult Bigfoot. The thought made my stomach churn. It wasn't just some story or myth, it was real, and we had been inches away from them. I felt a wave of nausea, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. We didn't have a camera with us. This was before everyone had smartphones with good cameras, so we couldn't take a picture, but we both knew what we were looking at. The print was there, undeniable. We didn't wait around any longer. We hurried back to the truck, not speaking much. The rustling sounds followed us for a while, but they gradually faded as we got closer to the road. When we finally reached the truck, I felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. We climbed in, and Eric started the engine, the sound loud and reassuring after the silence of the forest. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerging from the trees, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the forest shrinking behind us. We didn't talk about it on the drive back. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, but saying it out loud felt like admitting something we couldn't take back. When we got to the cabin, we packed up our stuff and left early, cutting the trip short. I remember sitting in the passenger seat, staring out the window, and feeling this deep, unsettled fear that I couldn't shake. It was like something had shifted in me, in the world, and I couldn't go back to how things were before. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. I've never gone back to that area, and I doubt I ever will. Eric and I have only mentioned it a handful of times since then, and each time we just kind of trail off, because there's no explanation that makes sense. People talk about Bigfoot like it's a joke, but for us, it's real. We saw it, we heard it, and we felt it, and that's something I'll never forget. Story 18. It was April of 2011. I remember that because it was one of those weirdly warm days you get in Kansas, the kind that makes you think winter's finally over, even though you know better. I was living in this little rental house just outside of Cheney, the kind of place that was cheap and quiet, which was all I really needed at the time. I'd gotten into the habit of taking walks in the afternoons just to clear my head. My job was stressful, and the silence out there by the Nineska River was about the only thing that helped. That day, I drove my old pickup down to one of the gravel pull-offs near the bridge. The air was still, no wind for once, and it smelled like wet earth and old leaves. I remember the sound of my boots on the gravel, that crunching noise that seems so loud when there's nothing else around. I walked out onto the bridge first, leaning on the rusty metal railing and just looking at the water. The river wasn't high, but it was moving steady, a brownish-green color, gurgling around the rocks and tree roots along the bank. It was peaceful, normal, the kind of normal you don't even think about until it's gone. I was about to head down the path that follows the riverbank when I saw some movement down to my left. My eyes just caught it, a shift in the shadows near the water's edge. At first I thought it was a deer. We get a lot of deer out there. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The sun was starting to go down, casting long, skinny shadows through the trees, so it was hard to see details. It wasn't a deer. It was a figure, maybe 30 yards away, squatting right at the waterline on a bunch of flat grey rocks. It was squatting in this really weird way, flat-footed with its knees up high. Its back was to me. It was covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, a medium brown color like dark walnut. But it had these lighter, almost rusty-colored patches on its shoulders and upper back. The hair wasn't shaggy or matted. It looked thick, like a really dense coat. My brain just sort of short-circuited. I thought, what the hell is that? My first stupid thought was that it was some guy in a gorilla costume, you know, like a prank. But that thought evaporated in about 2 seconds. The way it moved, it was so fluid, so natural. There was no stiffness, no sense of a person inside a suit. It was just living there, in that moment. It had these incredibly long arms, way longer than a person's. They hung down, and its hands were resting on the rocks. Its hands were huge. I remember that clearly. Big, dark, leathery-looking palms and thick fingers. It was using one of those hands to pick up a clam from a small pile next to it. It brought the clam to its mouth, and I saw it bite down. I heard a sharp crack, like when you step on a dry branch. It was cracking the shell with its teeth. Then it used its fingers to sort of pry it open, tilted its head back, and slurped out whatever was inside. It tossed the broken shell onto a big pile of other broken shells. This wasn't its first clam. I was frozen. I had a tight grip on the cold metal railing of the bridge. I wasn't even breathing hard. I was just holding my breath, my whole body tense. I was trying to process what I was seeing. The build of this thing was solid. Not fat, but powerfully built. Like a construction worker or a really serious athlete. If it had stood up, I guessed it would have been between 6 and 7 feet tall, maybe more. The sheer bulk of it was intimidating, and it never once looked my way. That was one of the strangest parts. It was completely focused on its clams. It would pick one, crack it, eat, toss the shell, over and over. It was so casual, so mundane. That's what made it so unreal. Here was this thing that shouldn't exist, having a snack by the river like it was the most normal thing in the world. That's when the fear started to creep in. It wasn't a jump scare kind of fear. It was a slow, cold dread that started in my gut and began seeping into the rest of me. This wasn't a costume. The proportions were all wrong. The length of the arms, the width of the shoulders, the way the head sat on its body. And it wasn't a bear. Bears don't sit like that. Bears don't have shoulders like that. Bears don't have those kind of hands. This was something else. My mind was screaming at me, but it had no name for what I was looking at. I remember a very clear, very stupid thought cutting through the panic. I need to get a camera. It felt like the most important mission in the world. Proof. I had to have proof. My camera was at home, an old digital point and shoot. I so slowly pushed myself back from the railing. My joints felt stiff. I took one step backward, then another. My eyes locked on the figure the whole time. It just kept eating. I turned and walked off the bridge, trying to be quiet, but my footsteps on the gravel sounded like gunshots to me. Once I was off the bridge and behind my truck, I broke into a run. A full-on, panicked sprint down the dirt path to where my truck was parked. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, painful drumming. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the door lock. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a second, just breathing, the cab of the truck smelling like old coffee and gasoline. I looked out the windshield, half expecting to see it standing there in the road. Nothing, just the quiet, empty lane. I started the truck and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. The whole drive home, maybe 5 minutes, my mind was racing. What was that? What the hell was that? I was trying to remember every detail. The color of the hair, the way it squatted, the sound of the shell cracking. I was already composing the story in my head, how I would tell someone. I got home, ran inside, and grabbed the camera from the kitchen counter. I didn't stop for anything else. I just ran back out, jumped in the truck and sped back to the river. The sun was lower now, the sky turning a deep orange and purple. The shadows were getting longer, merging together. I parked in the same spot, my tires crunching on the same gravel. My heart was still going crazy. This time, I felt a different kind of fear. The excitement of getting proof was now mixed with a deep, primal terror of going back to where that thing was. What if it was still there? What if it saw me this time? What if it wasn't happy about being photographed? I got out of the truck, the camera feeling small and useless in my sweaty hand. I walked slowly back toward the bridge, every sense on high alert. The woods were dead quiet, no birds, no squirrels rustling, nothing. Just the sound of the river and my own heartbeat in my ears. That silence was worse than any noise. I stepped onto the bridge again, my boots making soft thuds on the wooden planks. I walked to the same spot at the railing and looked down. It was gone. The spot on the rocks was empty. For a second, I felt a ridiculous pang of disappointment, like I'd missed my chance. I scanned the opposite bank, the trees, the water. Nothing. The woods were just dark, empty woods. I didn't just give up. I was determined. I walked down the path from the bridge, down to the river's edge. The mud was soft and sucked at my boots. I walked carefully toward the rocks where it had been. The air was cool and damp down there. I could see the pile of broken shells first. It was a big pile, white and pearly on the inside, dark and grimy on the outside. Dozens of them, all cracked open the same way. I stood there, right where it had been squatting. The rocks were still damp from the river. I looked at the shells. I looked at the impressions in the soft mud nearby. There were footprints, but they were a mess. Just deep, vague depressions. Nothing clear. Nothing you could take a cast of. I remember feeling the cold seep through the soles of my boots from the wet rock. I remember the smell of the river, that fishy, muddy smell, and underneath it, something else. A smell I'd never noticed before. It was musky, like a wet dog, but stronger, earthier. It was an animal smell. It hung in the air right in that spot. I lifted the camera, my finger hovering over the button. What was I going to take a picture of? A pile of shells, some messed up mud. I took a few pictures anyway. The shells, the river, the empty woods. It felt pointless. I lowered the camera and just stood there, feeling completely and utterly defeated. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving me shaky and cold. I walked back to my truck, the camera dangling from my wrist. I drove home in silence, not even turning on the radio. The whole world felt different. The familiar fields and farmhouses I passed looked alien, like a backdrop hiding something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't tell anyone. Not that night, not for months. Who would I tell? My buddies, they'd have laughed me out of the room. My family, they'd have worried I was cracking up from the stress. This was Kansas. You see weird lights in the sky, you keep it to yourself. You see a 7-foot-tall hairy thing eating clams by the river, you definitely keep it to yourself. So I did. I shoved it down, tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. I'd be lying in bed at night and I'd see it, clear as day, squatting there, cracking that shell. It was months later. Must have been late summer. I was watching the local news. They were doing one of those silly local mysteries segments. The anchor, this guy with too much hairspray, started talking about reported sightings of a large bipedal creature along the Ninniska River. My blood ran cold. I sat up on the couch, my dinner forgotten on the coffee table. They interviewed a couple of people, farmers mostly, who talked about seeing something big and dark moving through the trees or finding strange, large footprints. That was it. That was the push I needed. I called my sister that night. I just started talking, the words tumbling out of me. I told her everything, from the warm April afternoon to the pile of broken shells. I told her about the hair, the long arms, the way it never looked at me. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she just said, I believe you. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It made it more real. Her believing me meant it wasn't just in my head, it was out there. The fear that had been a background hum in my life suddenly settled in for good. It wasn't the heart-pounding terror of that day on the bridge. It was a deeper, quieter fear. The fear of knowing that the world is not as mapped and explained as you thought it was, that there are blank spots on the map, and things live in those blank spots. The thing that haunts me the most, the detail that I can't shake, is how casual it was. It wasn't a monster from a movie roaring and pounding its chest. It was just hungry. It was going about its business, having a meal by the river. I was the intruder. I was the one peeking into a world I wasn't supposed to see. That feeling of having witnessed something profoundly private and real, something that wasn't meant for human eyes, is what sticks with me. It's been years now, and I still walk by the river sometimes, but I'm never relaxed. I'm always alert, my eyes scanning the shadows, my ears straining for any sound that doesn't belong. I'm always half expecting, half dreading to see it again, squatting on those rocks, its back to me, completely unaware of the small, terrified human watching from a distance, forever changed by what he saw. Story 19. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it was a long time ago. I was out hunting with my tribe, like we often did. The air was crisp and cool, and the sun was just starting to peek through the trees. I could hear the birds chirping, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled my nose. We were tracking a deer, moving quietly through the dense forest, staying low and focused. I remember feeling proud to be part of the hunt, my heart beating steadily in my chest. But then, something shifted. I got separated from the others. I'm not even sure how it happened. One moment I was following the tracks, and the next I realized I couldn't hear anyone else. No footsteps, no whispers, just the rustle of leaves under my feet and the distant call of a crow. Panic started to creep in, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to call out, but my voice felt small and swallowed by the trees. That's when I saw them. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then they emerged from behind the thick trunks, towering figures, covered in dark, matted hair. They were huge, taller than any man I'd ever seen, with broad shoulders and arms that looked like they could snap a tree in half. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. There were several of them, moving so silently it was unnatural. No crunching leaves, no snapping twigs, just a smooth, graceful flow, like they were part of the forest itself. They surrounded me and I felt tiny, like a mouse caught by hawks. The air grew heavy, and I could smell something wild and musky, like wet animal fur mixed with earth. One of them stepped closer, and its eyes locked onto mine. They were deep and dark, almost black, and I felt a strange pull, like my mind was being tugged away from my body. It was overwhelming, a wave of dizziness that made my head spin. I tried to fight it, to look away, but I couldn't. My limbs felt heavy, and my thoughts turned fuzzy, like I was drifting off to sleep. The last thing I remember is that intense gaze, and then everything went blank. When I came to, I was somewhere else entirely, a hidden place in the mountains, surrounded by rough shelters made of cedar bark and woven branches. The giants were there, moving around me, and I realized I was their prisoner. But they didn't hurt me, not physically anyway. Over what felt like a year, I lived with them, almost as an equal. They'd bring back game from hunts, deer, sometimes elk, and we'd eat it raw, tearing into the meat with our hands. The taste was strong and metallic, and at first it made me sick, but I got used to it. They slept in those cedar bark shelters, and I did too, curled up on beds of leaves and moss. It was cold at night, and I'd shiver, listening to the wind howl outside. They communicated with these eerie whistling noises, high-pitched and melodic, but it sent chills down my spine every time. It was how they coordinated during hunts or when they moved around. I was allowed to wander the mountains at night, but never during the day, and I was never invited on their hunts. I'd watch them scamper up steep slopes like it was nothing, carrying heavy loads without breaking a sweat. Their strength was terrifying, but what scared me most was their silence. They moved like ghosts, and I always felt like I was being watched. The worst part was when they used that hypnotic power on me again. It happened a few times, usually when I tried to resist or when they needed me to do something. That same disorienting feeling would wash over me, and I'd become compliant, like a puppet on strings. I'd lose track of time, my mind floating in a fog. It was humiliating and frightening. I had no control over my own body. Then, one day, it all ended as suddenly as it began. I was in a trance again, my arms folded across my chest, my eyes staring ahead without seeing. They led me through the forest and I moved without thinking, my feet following theirs. The journey felt long, but in that state, time didn't mean much. When we stopped, I blinked and the trance lifted. I was back exactly where I had vanished, the same spot in the woods. The sun was higher now, casting dappled light through the trees. My body felt stiff and my mind was reeling. And there, sitting beside me, was a dog, a loyal-looking creature with warm eyes and a wagging tail. It nuzzled my hand, and I felt a surge of confusion and relief. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. Eventually, I made my way back to my tribe and told them everything. But to this day, I can't explain what really happened. Those giants were gentle in their way, but the memory haunts me. The silence, the whistling, and those eyes that held me captive. I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, thinking I'm back there in the mountains, surrounded by shadows that move too quietly.